The committee will come to order. It's a real pleasure for me to welcome Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, to the committee this afternoon for his first appearance testifying before Congress in his new capacity, although he's been to this committee a number of times over the years. We know you have an extremely busy schedule, particularly with the second round of trilateral U.S., Afghanistan, Pakistan meetings starting tomorrow. We appreciate your taking the time to be here. Our second panel this afternoon will feature several noted regional experts, including Christine Fair from the RAND Corporation, Lisa Curtis from the Heritage Foundation, and Dan Markey from the Council on Foreign Relations. I'll yield myself time for an opening statement. Ambassador Holbrooke, all of us are deeply concerned about the deteriorating security situation in Pakistan. As I noted in our recent hearing with Secretary Clinton, the United States has an enormous stake in the security and stability of that country. We can't allow al-Qaeda or any other terrorist group that threatens our national security to operate with impunity in the tribal regions of Pakistan. Nor can we permit the Pakistani state and its nuclear arsenal to be taken over by the Taliban. In short, it appears to many of us that Pakistan is at a tipping point, and we need to do whatever we can to make sure it goes the right way. We know you understand the gravity of the situation and commend you and your colleagues in the Obama administration for developing a comprehensive Afghanistan-Pakistan strategy. But now comes the hard part, translating that thoughtful strategy into real changes on the ground. How can the United States forge a true strategic partnership with Pakistan? What can we do to strengthen Pakistan's democratic government and to make it a force for stability in a volatile region? To help achieve these goals, a bipartisan group of my colleagues and I recently introduced H.R. 1886, the Pakistan Enduring Assistance and Cooperation Enhancement Act. This legislation would massively expand economic, social, and democracy assistance to Pakistan and also provide a significant increase in military assistance. Specifically, the bill provides funding to strengthen the capacity of Pakistan's democratic institutions, including its parliament, judicial system, and law enforcement agencies. It also calls for increased assistance for Pakistan's public education system, with an emphasis on access for women and girls. To demonstrate America's long-term commitment to the stability and democratic future of Pakistan, H.R. 1886 authorizes a permanent fund in the U.S. Treasury that will serve as a conduit for most non-military assistance to Pakistan. With regard to military assistance, our legislation increases funding for professional military education with an emphasis on training in counterinsurgency and in civil-military relationships. It boosts the funding available for Pakistan to purchase military equipment and requires that 75% of those funds be used for items directly related to counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. The legislation also codifies the 2006 contract between the United States and Pakistan that requires Pakistan to pay for F-16 fighter aircraft with its own national funds rather than American tax dollars. To strengthen civilian control of the military, H.R. 1886 mandates that all military assistance flow through Pakistan's elected civilian government. Finally, and there's been much discussion, and I think a great deal of misunderstanding, about the accountability provisions in this legislation. When I hear people talk about rigid or inflexible conditionality, I'm not sure exactly what they're referring to. Let me just read from the bill. Section 206 provides that no military assistance may be provided to Pakistan unless the President determines, and I'm quoting, that the government of Pakistan during the preceding fiscal year has demonstrated a sustained commitment to and made progress towards combating terrorist groups, including taking into account progress the government of Pakistan has made with regard to ceasing support, including by any element within the Pakistani military or its intelligence agency, to extremist and terrorist groups, particularly to any group that has conducted attacks against the U.S. or coalition forces in Afghanistan, including Afghan Afghanistan national security forces or against the territory of India or the people of India. Secondly, B, closing terrorist camps in the Fatah, dismantling terrorist bases in other parts of the country, including Quetta and Meridki, and taking action when provided with intelligence about high-level terrorist targets. C, preventing cross-border attacks into neighboring countries. And D, strengthening money laundering and anti-terrorism laws. These are just factors in the consideration the President would give. Ambassador Holbrooke, we are simply asking the Pakistanis to keep the commitments they have already made to fight the terrorists who threaten our national security and theirs, and that they make some progress doing so, with progress defined very broadly. If Pakistan is unable to if the President is unable to make that determination, or a second one relating to cooperation on nuclear nonproliferation, then he always can take advantage of the waiver we provide. Which of these conditions are reasonable or unattainable? And if they are, what does that tell us about our relationship with Pakistan? We hear that the administration will soon propose its own set of benchmarks for Pakistan. We look forward to working with you on accountability measures as H.R. 1886 moves through the legislative process, and we remain very open to hearing other formulations of the kind of accountability that I think all of us want. Ambassador Holbrooke, we look forward to hearing your assessment of the situation in Pakistan, your recommendations for implementing the Afghanistan-Pakistan strategy, and your thoughts on the legislation we recently introduced. I now turn to my good friend, the ranking member, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, for any statement she may want to make.
Thank you so much, as always, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador, and the other panelists who will be with us today. I will focus my remarks on the outcome of the recent review and its implications for policy going forward. We are united in our goals. We want a long-term partnership with a modern, prosperous, and democratic Pakistan that is at peace with itself and with its neighbors, a Pakistan that maintains robust controls over its nuclear weapons technology, and a Pakistan that does not provide safe havens to al-Qaeda, Taliban, other Islamic militant extremists. While command and control of Pakistan's nuclear arsenal is presumably a top concern to Islamabad, recent Taliban advances underscore the critical importance of ensuring security for its nuclear materials and technology. As Secretary Clinton testified recently, the nuclear weapons have been dispersed throughout Pakistan, increasing the risk that they may find their way to al-Qaeda, to Taliban, and other Islamic extremists. We must redouble our efforts on Pakistan's technical and human security capacity so as to ensure that there is a robust safeguard mechanism in place for its nuclear weapons program and facilities. The stakes are simply too high to ignore. The administration has endorsed Senate proposals to increase non-military assistance to Pakistan to $1.5 billion over the next 5 years. When combined with existing or contemplated assistance programs, total U.S. aid to Pakistan, including reimbursement to the Pakistani military by the Department of Defense, would total at least $3.5 billion per fiscal year, or about $17.5 billion total over the next 5 years. Operationally, how are we going to effectively put such funds to use? The American Embassy in Islamabad is under a virtual lockdown because of security concerns. We have withdrawn critical staff from our key consular outposts along the Pakistani frontier, and because of the difficult security environment, our Foreign Service officers generally only serve one-year tours in Pakistan. This means that they will have barely begun to understand their brief before they are rotated out, and we lose critical institutional memory. The administration proposes to remedy this difficulty in part with an $800 million request in the supplemental appropriations bill for embassy security, construction, and maintenance for Pakistan. Completion of these projects, however, will in some cases take several months and in others many years. While issues of U.S. diplomatic concerns get sorted out, the administration has suggested that it may allocate much of the proposed increase in non-military aid primarily toward budget support. Any proposed U.S. budget support would be in addition to at least $14 billion committed by the international financial institutions through the year 2013. Some would contend that enhanced trade with Pakistan may be far more economically meaningful than expanded aid. There are legislative efforts, we're told, that the administration supports that would create reconstruction opportunity zones in Afghanistan and in the border areas of Pakistan. Unfortunately, about a third of Pakistan's annual exports to the U.S. would be excluded from the definition of eligible products. There is limited industrial activity on the border areas of Pakistan and Afghanistan, obviously. The Pakistani state is finding it hard to provide for basic amenities for its current population, much less after the expected boom in its population size. Further, under the circumstances, entrepreneurs are likely to be wary of new investments in the proposed industrial zones. The U.S. therefore needs to think far more boldly about mechanisms to expand trade opportunities in Pakistan and elsewhere in the developing world. Turning to the immediate security concerns and urgently needed assistance on this front, there needs to be a secure and reliable source of funding, not just for military assistance, but to assist the police and civilian law enforcement as the first line of defense against extremists. Some observers have recently argued that past cutoffs, which in turn affected IMET programs, have seriously harmed our bilateral efforts and have made those Pakistani officers not participating in IMET increasingly vulnerable to Islamic militants. Ambassador Holbrooke, do you see any correlation between this and the rising pro-Taliban sentiment within the ranks of the Pakistani military? This raises the core question of political will, as implicit in proposals to dramatically ramp up U.S. foreign assistance is the assumption that Pakistan's political class shares the increasing U.S. concern about the threat posed to their own country by Islamic radicals. If U.S. and Pakistani strategic priorities are seriously misaligned, then American foreign assistance will be of fleeting significance. Congress and the executive branch must move quickly toward a common understanding on the immediate and longer-term priorities, the appropriate mix of policy instruments to maximize our prospects for success, and the timeline for implementing the different strategies, the different elements of our strategy. Ultimately, if we are to succeed in eliminating safe havens and strengthening the democracy in Pakistan, it will require the steadiness of purpose in Washington, but perhaps more importantly, commensurate commitments by Islamabad. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for your time.
The time of the gentlelady has expired. We're now going to hear from the opening statements from the chair and the ranking member of the subcommittee on the South Asia and the Middle East. 3 minutes, and then we'll have a chance for other members to give 1-minute opening statements, but we're not going to have a chance for other members to give 1-minute opening statements because we want to hear from Ambassador Holbrooke, but you will get 5 minutes of questions for Ambassador Holbrooke. And we do have a second panel, so I think that is the appropriate decision. I now yield 3 minutes to the chairman of the South Asian Middle East Subcommittee, Mr. Ackerman.
Thank you. Let's say that your pants were on fire. You'd have to do 2 things to survive. First, you'd have to recognize that the agonizing pain that you feel was a result of your pants being on fire. And second, you'd have to do something about it before you lost the ability to do something about it. Let me be blunt. Pakistan's pants are on fire. That's bad, of course, but things are actually much, much worse. Pakistan's leaders, rather than recognizing and moving to address the urgent danger to their constitution and country, instead seem convinced that if left alone, that appeased or attacked piecemeal, the Islamist flame will simply burn itself out. That hope is at best folly. Tragically, neither President Zardari nor former Prime Minister Sharif appear to recognize the scope and seriousness of the crisis that their country is in, or of the necessity of setting their personal or party political fortunes aside in order to meet the danger. President Zardari has said the right things regarding counterterrorism, about how to fight against al-Qaeda and the Taliban is Pakistan's fight as well, but in practice his government's response has been slow, weak, and ineffective, as recent events have shown. And while Mr. Sharif's long-standing ties to Islamist political parties could enable him to persuade the Pakistani public of the need to confront the Taliban, his public downplaying of the Taliban threat raises serious questions about his commitment to fight the insurgents. Whatever the rationale or the reason, the fact is Pakistan's political echelon has not yet risen to meet the moment. Historically, one could expect that if the political situation remains as unstable as it is now, and if neither leader moves beyond his narrow political concerns, that the Pakistani military might again emerge as the only institution capable of saving the state. I fear, however, that this time might be different. Even now, with insurgents a mere hour's drive from the capital, I suspect that among the senior officers of the Pakistani military in particular, those with connections to the ISI, their bedrock belief is still that Pakistan's real enemy is India, remains untouched by events. Pakistan's government, its military, and most importantly its people must come to realize that the militants and terrorists they nurtured and supported for decades to fight in Kashmir and to antagonize India have now turned on them. I and many other friends of Pakistan have said again and again that the fight against extremists is not just an American fight, nor is it solely an Afghan fight. The fight belongs to Pakistan before, and it belongs to Pakistan now. I cannot say it more clearly. There is a real and present danger to Pakistan's survival, but it comes from inside, not outside the country. The fire is real, and they need to respond.
The time of the gentleman has expired, and I'm now pleased to introduce our first witness. Ambassador Richard Holbrooke currently serves as Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. From 1999 to 2001, he served as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. As Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs from 1994 to 1996, he brokered the Dayton Peace Accords, which ended the bloody wars in the Balkans. In his long and distinguished diplomatic career, Ambassador Holbrooke has also served as Special Envoy to Cyprus and the Balkans, U.S. Ambassador to Germany, and Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. I will introduce the second panel after questioning for Ambassador Holbrooke has finished. Ambassador Holbrooke, it's yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is a great honor to appear before you as the first opportunity I've had to testify before Congress since I assumed my new job, but far from the first opportunity I've had to appear before your committee. You were kind enough to invite me here. As a private citizen, you are, by my count, the sixth chairman of this committee I've testified before. In fact, it was the first committee I ever testified before in 1977. In those days, the rules were different, and I was asked to testify before I was confirmed, but things have changed. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 1886 is a step forward in concept from previous legislation in previous years. It's focused on the right issues. It puts Pakistan in the right construct. It responds to the importance of the issue as outlined by both you and the ranking member and my friend Congressman Ackerman, who thinks I live in his district because I'm next to it. So it's good to see you, sir. My actual congressman, for the record, is Jerry Nadler, but I'm happy to consider you my second congressman. This is a very important part of our effort to build correct policy. And with your permission, before I turn to the legislation and answer your questions, I would like to outline for you and for anyone who's listening what is going on in the next 3 days here in Washington, because these are historically important meetings, and I think we should put them in the context. The administration began its term in office with the concept we're now all familiar with, that Afghanistan and Pakistan were interrelated in such a way so that success in either one required success in the other. Sounds simple now, but it was not the stovepiped approach that we inherited. And as we proceeded with our strategic review, and as we progressed, things developed. In late February, the Secretary of State invited the foreign ministers of Afghanistan and Pakistan to Washington and asked them to bring delegations with them to begin a trilateral process. That first round of trilateral talks was sufficiently successful so that the President Obama, decided to invite President Zardari of Pakistan and President Karzai of Afghanistan here to continue the talks at the presidential level. This unprecedented trilateral diplomacy, including many senior members of both administrations, begins today. I will go directly from this meeting to meetings with members of the two governments. I already met with President Zardari last night, and I know that you will be meeting with President Zardari later in the day. And I would like to say, in the presence of so many of your colleagues, that that meeting with President Zardari this afternoon is an extremely important part of the formation of a correct American policy towards Afghanistan, and I congratulate you for chairing it. Your colleagues on the other side will have a similar meeting at lunch on Thursday, chaired by Senator Kerry and Senator Lugar. The meetings will begin tomorrow morning, the formal meetings, in the State Department. Secretary Clinton will meet privately with each delegation bilaterally, and then there will be a trilateral session in which we hope to produce some useful agreements of cooperation. We will then move to the White House tomorrow afternoon, where President Obama will follow a similar scenario, meeting first with President Karzai and then with President Zardari in strict protocol sequence, and then a trilateral meeting of the two delegations. This has not been done before. President Bush did have one dinner with the two presidents when it was Musharraf and Karzai, but it resulted in no progress and there was no follow-on. This is part of a continuing process, and we would like your committee and the Congress as a whole to be partners in this very important effort. It's interesting, Mr. Chairman, to discover that the two finance ministers have never met each other till they will meet tomorrow. The two agriculture ministers don't know each other. The two interior ministers do not know each other. And yet, for the United States, our most vital national security interests depend on cooperation between Pakistan and Afghanistan. The animosity and misunderstandings between Afghanistan and Pakistan did not begin after 9/11 or even when the Soviet Union invaded 30 years ago. They go back to the origins of they go back to independence, partition, Pakistani independence. And it is an extraordinarily complicated story. We are involved in it because our most vital national security interests are at stake. I've heard people, including people in this body, compare this to Vietnam. I served 3.5 years in Vietnam as a civilian alongside the United States military in the Mekong Delta and in the American Embassy. And then I served another 4 years on Vietnam as a member of President Johnson's staff and the Paris Peace Talks. And I wrote one volume of the Pentagon Papers. And I want to say to you today and to your colleagues, as clearly as I can, that while there are obvious structural similarities between the war in Afghanistan and the war in Vietnam, and in both countries the problem of the sanctuary is critical, and the sanctuary area is the area we're here to discuss today, the core difference is that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army never posed a direct threat to the American homeland. And the people who are in this area, who we are fighting, either pose and are planning, pose a direct threat, having committed 9/11, having done Mumbai, having killed Benazir Bhutto, and they have publicly said they're going to do more of the same. That's Al-Qaeda, of course, and its allies, the Taliban. So we need to be very clear that we are talking today about an issue that is of direct importance to our national security. Now, in regard to H.R. 1886, this is a very big improvement on previous legislation. It vastly increases the economic assistance. It segments economic and military. The accountability provisions that you referred to apply, as I understand it, only to the military portion, a point which has been lost in the debate over it. And there are many other things in it that we greatly appreciate. And I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and your colleagues, particularly the ranking minority member, for their bipartisanship in putting this bill together. It is very important, and we hope that it will be passed and that the differences with the House and Senate versions will be reconciled. Having said that, I also wish to echo what Secretary of State Clinton said when she was asked about the accountability, and that is that we should be careful that we look for a sweet spot that is acceptable. Now, let me be clear here. The goals that you lay out in the accountability section are goals that we by and large share. But there has been a misunderstanding in Pakistan about motivation and about how this works. And so we would like to work with you. And I believe in this regard, Mr. Chairman, your meeting this afternoon with President Zardari is very important, arguably more important than this hearing. We would like to work with you and with the Pakistani government to find that sweet spot that Secretary Clinton referred to. In conclusion of my opening remarks, let me ask your permission to submit my formal opening statement for the record and to thank you very much, really deeply and personally, for your leadership in this most important issue. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ambassador, and without objection, your entire statement will be included in the record of this hearing, and I'll yield myself 5 minutes. In the last few weeks, and some of us were actually there when this was in Pakistan when this was starting, we've heard a stream of dire reporting from Pakistan and statements from administration officials regarding the situation in Pakistan. It is unquestionably a critical one. I'm aware that the main institution in Pakistan, the military, remains intact, and that there are concerns among the Pakistani press that the U.S. is lending an air of panic to the situation. Talk to us for a moment about how critical the threat is and what efforts we are undertaking to communicate U.S. intentions to address the threat directly to the Pakistani people.
You know, the relationship between the United States and Pakistan, which goes back to the birth of Pakistan as an independent nation, is a complicated relationship between allies who have often misunderstood each other. I make that comment when I hear you refer to, when you use the phrase U.S. lending an air of panic or contributing to an air of panic about the situation.
According to the Pakistani press.
Yes, and if, you know, so what's actually we had a kind of an echo chamber situation. If you analyze it, and it's worth looking at for a minute, we spent a lot of time on this, Mr. Chairman. We've had extensive meetings in the State Department, the White House, trying to make sure that people understand exactly what we're saying. When SWAT fell and the deal was made, the concern that was expressed was not initially in the United States. It was among the people of Peshawar and Lahore and Islamabad, who understandably felt threatened. SWAT is not just another location. It is a very symbolic location. It's not part of the tribal areas. It was a vacation place. I like to point out to my New York friends that it's the same distance from Manhattan as East Hampton is from New York, and it bears the same psychological relationship to the people of Islamabad as a vacation spot, although real estate prices were not quite as high. And
And we won't talk about the parties.
no, please. But all joking aside, the fall of SWAT created an air of panic, not in the United States initially, but among certain people in Pakistan, even in India. I found people who recalled their vacations in SWAT and were stunned by its fall. That then came back to the United States. People going out to Pakistan, including members of the Congress, came back and made strong statements. Private citizens made strong statements. One very well-known counterinsurgency expert, not a member of the U.S. government, not a consultant, said they had a matter of months before they might hit the wall. And this began to create a ricochet effect. And so, without anyone intending it, honest, well-intentioned statements of concern became interpreted as predictions. It was and the press magnified this. I'm not actually blaming anyone. I'm not blaming the people who made the statements. They were pro-Pakistan. I'm not blaming the press. They were reporting them. But it really took off as a story. And in that atmosphere, President Zardari arrived in town yesterday. And he raised this issue with me immediately. And let me say frankly to you, I understand his concern. And we all understand it. So with your permission, Mr. Chairman, let me make very, very clear why he's here and what our goals are in Pakistan, so that we can try to dispel a self-fulfilling sense of what Congressman Ackerman called the pants on fire syndrome. Now, he said the pants really are on fire, and I understand exactly what he said, but I also think it needs to be put in the perspective of what we're trying to achieve. I would submit to you that Pakistan is of immense importance to the United States strategically and politically, that our goal must be unambiguously to support and help stabilize a democratic Pakistan, headed by its elected president, Asif Ali Zardari. I read in the newspapers that the administration is distancing itself from President Zardari in favor of his leading political opponent, Nawaz Sharif, in the Punjab. That's simply not true. We have not distanced ourselves from President Zardari. If we were, why would President Obama have invited him to Washington today? Why would we be here today talking about additional money for his government? However, we do have relations with Nawaz Sharif and his brother, who's the Chief Minister of the Punjab, just the way we have relations with, let's say, David Cameron, the leader of the opposition in Great Britain. This is the point that needs to be underscored here, is that we have the highest strategic interests in supporting this government. That's what H.R. 1886 is about, and that is what our administration is trying to do. And we should not allow comments about how serious the issue is to be confused with predictions of a collapse. We do not think Pakistan is a failed state. We think it's a state under extreme test from the enemies who are also our enemies, and we have, Mr. Chairman, the same common enemy, the United States and Pakistan.
My time has more than expired. I didn't mention, and I should, that I'll recognize people for 5 minutes. It will include their question and your answer. I now yield 5 minutes to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. How would you describe Pakistan's commitment to rooting out militant groups? To what extent is Pakistan leery of taking on this challenge for two reasons. It's a strategic concern with India and a perception that such a campaign either cannot be won or is actually against Pakistan's interest. Related to that, does the current situation in Pakistan make you any more concerned about the safety and security of the nuclear weapons, particularly the prospect of a radicalized military and the possibility of an inside job, meaning the seizure of some part of the arsenal by anti-American radicals within the Pakistani armed forces? And thirdly, since we have so much time, if Americans are worried about Pakistan turning into a failed state, and I agree with you, it is not a failed state, our friends in India ought to be extremely concerned. And I was interested in your comments on this question. In your discussion with leaders in India about the situation in Pakistan, how would you assess their level of concern? Thank you, sir.
Could you just, the first point was which? I got the second and third.
The commitment of the Pakistan in rooting out these militant groups. Are they hesitant because they think that they can't do it, or because of the problems that they have with India?
On your first point, we have long felt that our friends in Pakistan could put more resources into the struggle in the West. They have been reluctant to do so because of their long-standing concerns and past history with India, and we will continue to press on that. In the interest of time, let me just say on the nuclear issue, most of this needs to be discussed in closed session. It is not an issue I have personally concentrated on because there's such an overwhelming agenda on other issues. I have followed it. I'd be happy to discuss it further in closed session and bring with me the experts. On the last question, thank you for saying that Pakistan's not a failed state. It's very important people get away from easy and attractive journalistic cliches. It just isn't. But it is a state under enormous social, political, and economic pressures, and India is always a factor. Finally, I want to be clear that when I talked about 1886, your bill, I greatly appreciate its motives, but I do want to be sure that I'm preserving the fact that there are things in it which Secretary Clinton and I and my colleagues do want to work with you on. To be clear, and as we've talked privately, there are other bills moving forward on the appropriations side. It is, and I want to underscore the point made in this morning's Washington Post by Ahmed Rashid in the article Pakistan's Critical Hour, which I hope would be well read, and perhaps it could be even inserted
Thank you,
into the
Mr.
record.
Ambassador. Just because we have such limited time, would you say that related to the Indian leaders and their perception of Pakistan, in your discussions with them, how do they see that
The Indians?
playing out for them?
Ever since I took this job, India's been in an election campaign. They're voting right now. There's 700 million people voting. They have been listening. They've been very interested, but they have not taken any clear positions. At this point, the elections will be finished in about less than 2 weeks, and I look forward to returning, and then I would be happy to return and give you a better answer. But let me just say one thing. They really do share the understanding that what's happening in western Pakistan is of direct concern to them. They are not, the Indians have been public in saying they're not happy with the cooperation they got after the Mumbai attacks. We all know that. I believe that for the first time since partition, India, Pakistan, and the United States have a common threat, a common enemy, and a common task. And I hope that after the elections and after these bills that are working the Hill work their way through, that we will be able to move to more of a consensus that a common threat requires common actions. But there are a lot of moving parts here.
Sir, and we certainly understand that you endorsed that bill. You don't need to plug it in every answer. We get it. Thank you. Good job, Mr. Chairman.
Well, since the ranking member has committed your administration's endorsement to my bill, I will commit that as soon as we can, we will get together with members of the administration to discuss in the terms of both the Secretary and you finding the sweet spot.
Thank you.
And Mr. Ackerman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Very good to see you again, Mr. Ambassador, and congratulations.
Thank you.
The proposed sale of the new F-16s to Pakistan, will they be using that to fight the terrorists?
You're talking now about the new planes or the midlife upgrades? What are we specifically referring to?
The F-16 CD Block 50-52s, combat aircraft, 18 new ones.
The 18 new ones. First of all, as you know, the midlife upgrades are moving forward with $142 million of payment, and they have to pay for these. I am told by F-16 pilots that an F-16 with modern avionics can be used as a counterinsurgency tool, but quite honestly, it requires very sophisticated training. They did use the aging F-16s in their battles in Bajur Valley and in Swat, but they can only be used in daylight and with good visibility. They can't be used at night. So we have not come to a final decision on how to proceed with this, and I know your body is looking at it very carefully. Right now, we have approved the midlife upgrade, so they will be able to convert planes to counterinsurgency use.
What could you tell us in this open session about the ISI and their double game strategy, as some people have called it, in cooperating with terrorist elements? And I know it's not the whole ISI, but possibly just corrupt elements or individuals within it.
Ever since I began working on this difficult issue, I've been well aware of the allegations to which you refer, and we have looked into them very carefully in the first 100 days of this administration. I have had lengthy talks with the director of ISI, General Pasha, who is in Washington today, and who I hope will get a chance to meet with some of you. General Pasha wishes to state, and would tell you if he were here, that ISI does not do these things anymore, but he does not deny, nor does anyone else, that in the old days, ISI and the American intelligence services worked together to set up some of the organizations which have now turned against the United States, and there may be some serious legacy issues. It concerns me greatly, and we need to put the most heavy possible pressure on our friends in Pakistan to join us in the fight against the Taliban and its allies. We cannot succeed in Afghanistan without Pakistan's support and involvement, and that means working with the Army and the intelligence services in that regard.
In as much as you brought up putting pressure on our friends, how much pressure should we put on them to give us access to AQ Khan?
I consider it hard.
Mr. Chairman, could we just ask those people passing those signs around to put them down?
Yeah, will the gentleman please put down his sign that is inappropriate in the committee hearing room? And would the gentleman be like to leave the room? Otherwise, he'll remain quiet. Mr. Ackerman?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If the ambassador would continue.
The
AQ Khan.
I find it hard to understand, and I said publicly as a private citizen, I found it inexplicable that AQ Khan was not immediately made available to the United States. We had no access, and I just don't understand it, quite frankly. Given the immense amount of damage he
But
did.
that was history.
I
and
know, I
previous
understand.
What do we do now? He's still there. He still knows what he knows.
I have
And
raised
we still
it.
don't know what we don't know.
I have raised it with the Pakistani government. Their response is, this happened under the previous government.
Yeah, but the guy still has the ability to talk and give us
I
information.
quite understand, Congressman. I share your...
If it's a good idea, should we make those F-16s conditional on talking to him to find out to what extent he might have given technology or material to terrorist organizations or failed states or what have you?
I do not think that linkage will help either half of the equation, but I certainly share your concern. I raised it on my first trip there. I raised it publicly. I will continue to raise it. But I just think that the linkage would work against both issues, but I understand the importance of it. I share your view.
Does the civilian government of Pakistan have control over the military?
The military in Pakistan has a long tradition of serving within the government, but having a sort of its own role. So there are other countries like this.
But the government still has a strong tradition of being overthrown by the military.
Well, that's another matter. We are strongly opposed to any such event, Congressman Ackerman. We have made that unambiguous and clear to all parties, publicly and privately. The chairman of our Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, is in constant contact with his Pakistani counterparts on this issue, and we think this would be a terrible event. In over half of Pakistan's history since independence, they have had military rule.
The time of the gentleman has expired, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher. Recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, I wish you well, and I'm very pleased that you were selected and have gone about this job, this incredible task that you have. And just as pointed as my questions will be, do not think that I am not rooting for you to succeed in your job.
Thank you.
First of all, let me note that I do agree with with the chairman of the subcommittee. I would suggest that it's time for us to get real with Pakistan, and to the degree that we have, over my career, we have bent over backwards historically for this last 30 years to sort of not to come to grips with some real issues, and thus we've let things fester and has gotten progressively worse. So it's time for us really to lay down a standard and say, what's reality here? And if there are leaders in Pakistan who oppose our getting to the real facts concerning A.Q. Khan, then those people are not our friends. The bottom line is, if they were something of that significance, of that magnitude, if the leaders of Pakistan are not permitting us to have the type of accountability for this individual and what's been done, then frankly those people are not our friends and do not deserve the type of support that we're trying to give them. Just for the record, if you have a disagreement with that, please go straight ahead.
The issues that you and Congressman Ackerman raised should have been dealt with at the outset. A decision was made by another group of American officials not to raise them. A new administration came to office on January 2nd, facing a different set of problems. I raised A.Q. Khan immediately upon my being in Pakistan, and I will continue to raise it. But the issue that Congressman Ackerman raised, and it's a very important one, is whether we should condition our own strategic interests. He linked it to the F-16s, but you've made it an even broader issue.
Yes.
To this issue. At this time, There's no evidence that he's actively engaged in these things anymore. It would be enormously valuable to know what he did. The ice has frozen over this issue in a sense. I would love to crack it open, but Congressman, as we speak, and as Chairman Berman pointed out at the beginning, the enemy of our nation, as well as Pakistan, is active in the field not too far from the capital. We need to help Pakistan, and we need to weigh the help against the accountability issues to find the right balance.
I'm running out of time, too, and let me just note that Pakistan, if Pakistan is unwilling to work together with us on something as significant as the nuclear weapons perhaps in the hands of terrorists who might do harm to the United States, well, then they do not deserve our help. Let's make it very clear. If a nuclear weapon goes off in the United States, and it's because we have not followed through with what this Khan character has been doing with other radical Islamicists, well, then we have not been doing due diligence to our own people. You were in Vietnam, and at that time, and you mentioned that, the support for the Vietnamese battle against us was Russia and China. We are now at war with radical Islam in Pakistan and Afghanistan in particular. Where are the radical Islamicists who are fighting this war against us getting their financial support to maintain this struggle?
The other elements in other countries have been sending money to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda.
Does that include Saudi Arabia?
It includes people in Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
I don't have any evidence that includes the government, but certainly money is flowing into what you might call the bad guys from the Gulf, from Pakistan, and from other places in the world under the Hawala system, under hand-carried money. We do not have a program to close that down now. We are working on it actively. Our most senior officials have a task force that is trying to address this, and it is very high on our list.
Good luck in that operation, and also I hope that we are going to do the drug deals, the drug challenge as well.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Wexler, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, we welcome you here as well and are rooting very much for you also. Recently, Deputy Secretary Lew and Deputy Secretary Steinberg came before our committee and presented the administration's new plans for Afghanistan. And if I understand it correctly, in a nutshell, it calls for 17,000 additional troops in southern Afghanistan and an additional 4,000 troops on top of that.
Trainers.
Yes. You very eloquently talk about the interdependence of our Afghanistan and Pakistan policies and the interrelationship between Afghanistan and Pakistan, or the lack of interrelationship. Could you share with us what the anticipated repercussion, the anticipated goal of the additional troops in Afghanistan will be with respect to Pakistan? And can you also share with us, in terms of Al-Qaeda's two senior leaders, bin Laden and Zawahiri, what role do we believe them to be playing, if we know, in terms of the current circumstances in Pakistan? And finally, what role, if any, is Iran playing, and is there a potential for cooperation, possibly, with respect to Iran in terms of resolving the crisis in Pakistan?
On your first question, Congressman Wexler, I believe the troops will make an enormous difference. They're going into a very difficult area. They're well prepared for it and well led. I know the commanders. They will displace the Taliban as long as they're there. The real test is, can they transfer that responsibility to local security forces over time? As they progress, I think we can expect the Taliban, elements of the Taliban, some will fade back into the villages, like all guerrillas do, and others will go east into Pakistan towards the Baluchistan area, and that is an issue that has to be addressed. On your second point on Osama bin Laden, you wanted to know what their role was vis-a-vis the Taliban? Or
Vis-a-vis the circumstances in Pakistan today, is it our understanding, do we have any information in terms of what role they are playing?
in Afghanistan?
In terms of what's happening in Pakistan.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood. In regard to Al-Qaeda, I think it's very well described in an article in this morning's New York Times where a Taliban spokesman said, "We do the local war against the Americans. Al-Qaeda does the global war." And finally, on your question about Iran, very interesting point. There have been two major conferences in the last month, March 31st in The Hague on Afghanistan, April 17th in Tokyo in Pakistan. The latter was a pledging conference. The Iranians attended both in The Hague at the vice foreign minister level and in Tokyo in Pakistan at the foreign minister level. And in Tokyo, they pledged $330 million to the reconstruction effort for Pakistan. Quite an interesting thing to do. They could have done it bilaterally. They could have done it in some other method. And the speech that the foreign minister gave was one in which he outlined policy goals that were similar to ours. Now, we have vast and important differences with Iran on nuclear weapons, Hamas, Hezbollah, Israel, and many other critical issues. But here is one area where there seems to be a strategic similarity. They don't want the Taliban, whom they hate, to succeed. They have vested interests on their eastern border. Herat is a city with very old historic cultural links to Iran. The drug flow into Iran has caused a massive drug addiction problem. And so it looks to me like, for reasons that don't make them nice guys, but just are facts, they're looking at this area as an area where instability would be adverse to them.
Thank you very much.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Ambassador Holbrooke. I joined Chairman Berman on his delegation to India and Pakistan, and I had an opportunity there to talk to General Kiani about the insurgency that's occurring and building in the Swat Valley, the tentacles that are going out from Swat. One of the quick observations I'd make is that Abdul Aziz was released. This is the individual from the Red Mosque who had led so many young suicide bombers to commit attacks in the Punjab and in the capital, and he was out publicly preaching jihad and an overthrow of the government because Supreme Court Justice Chowdhury had released him. And I guess as we look at the situation of the graduates coming out of the madrasas, the New York Times said yesterday 2/3 of the suicide bombers in Punjab have attended those schools. My question would be, is there the will in Pakistan to put in place a curriculum that isn't hostile? And is there the will to defeat the insurgency in Swat? On the radio front, you've raised the point, Ambassador, that like with Rwandan hate radio, we have the Taliban radio, 150 illegal radio stations. I'd ask on the jamming equipment, what is the status? I know you've been working to try to get that jamming assistance with the Pakistani government.
Big issue for us.
A couple other questions I'd just leave you with. One, you'd mentioned trade, and I want to encourage you on that front because I think giving Pakistan greater market access could do more good than aid that, frankly, we have a limited capacity to implement. If it's a real trade and real engagement, you might have to take leadership on this. I think the Van Halen approach is kind of unrealistic, but that might help civil society there. The last point I'd like to ask you about is on Afghan contracting, because that process in the country is really a mess. There's quite a bit of blowback. Corruption is rampant there, and the resentment that creates among Afghans is a problem. And I think this is compounded when a foreign firm, I'll take one example, Turkish firm brings in Turkish labor, doesn't hire Afghani labor. That does not build Afghani capacity. So it's very hard for American firms, of course, to compete in this corrupt environment. And I think from community leaders here in the Afghan community, we have many engineers in the Afghan community who would like to go back, get engaged, hire Afghans, obviously, in order to build capacity there. And I think there's something you could directly do on that front which would help turn that around. But if I could ask your responses on some of those questions.
A very limited time, a lot of questions. Let me just take the
2 minutes and 20 seconds.
16 seconds, Mr. Chairman. The Afghan contracting issue, I agree fully with you, but let's not limit it to competition with Turks. We've got a lot to answer for here ourselves. You know that only about 10% of American assistance in Afghanistan goes through the government. So I want to increase that to at least 40 or 50% because we're trying to build up Afghan capacity and we're undermining it by that process. And this is one of the things we discovered as we did our due diligence of what we inherited. I'd like to, however, use the remaining 1 minute and 36 seconds to ask you about the ROZs. I liked Van Hollen's legislation. I publicly supported it, and I know there are differences between the Senate and House versions, but it is a very important idea. Congresswoman Ross Slotinen talked about it in her opening remarks. I share her comments. Perhaps I could just get a sense of why you disagreed with it.
I think that requiring American fabric in this, you and I worked on the African Growth and Opportunity Act to try to create economic growth. We double trade between Africa and the United States. In my view, attempting to micromanage this with American fabric, as I've made the observation, we're going to have limited ability to have an impact with the aid that we do give. But in terms of trade, we are going to have a capacity to build civil society there, create jobs, and if we do that in tandem with education and getting people out of the madrasas and into public education, which was once the case until the government made the decision to put all the money into armaments, then I think we're confronting some of the problems long term that might turn things around.
I understand. As long as we agree that the general concept is correct, that's what I wanted to understand. Because it's up to you to work out the details. We want some legislation. It's really a high symbolic importance.
Ambassador, is there the will in the Swat Valley for the government to go in and get...
The government went back in yesterday, and this morning the deal broke down. President Zardari had always predicted this would happen. The first thing he said to me last night was, I told you this deal wasn't going to work. Remember, Zardari had opposed it, and he was forced to agree to it. So he said, his answer to your question is, the Army is going back in as we speak.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Ambassador Holbrooke. It's good to see you again. It's my understanding that over the last 7 years, we've provided about $12 billion in aid to Pakistan for military equipment and military training and resources. And yet, Pakistani Army Chief of Staff General Parvez Kayani said his troops do not have the necessary equipment to fight the militants. Given just the level of our aid, how is that possible? What is going on in Pakistan that they have inadequate resources to fight the militants?
Very simple, Congressman Conley. The aid went for the wrong sort of assistance. They didn't get night vision goggles. They didn't get helicopters. Secondly, their own existing helicopter fleet is very inadequately maintained, and we want to help them with that too. Third, there wasn't a sufficient effort made to encourage a reconfiguration of the Army for counterinsurgency. Fourth, events between India and Pakistan always kept a larger number of troops in the east than in the west. You're now addressing the core point which any military analyst would say has to be fixed. Otherwise, you end up in a whack-a-mole situation where you can fight them in Bajur and they'll appear in Swat. You can fight them in Swat and they'll be in Waziristan. There are not adequate numbers of troops, in my view, in the West. I think that my colleague, General Petraeus, would say exactly the same thing.
Do we have an understanding, Mr. Ambassador, or growing understanding with the Pakistani government that that needs to be corrected?
There is no question, Congressman Conley, that recent events have increased the readiness of both sides to address that problem. Whether it's sufficient or not will be determined partly in the next few days. General Kayani, however, is not here. He is back in the country where he should be, directing these military offensives. But other senior military officials are here, and Admiral Mullen is practically commuting to Pakistan. I'll be going back next week. Your own chairman was just there. I think every discussion we ever have, this is sort of like the number one issue.
It could, because it just seems to me if we're going to have confidence in providing more aid to Pakistan in this hour of need, we have to have some assurances it's not just going to go to further the buildup and reinforce the capacity vis-a-vis the perceived threat from India.
Well, I agree with that, and I think that can be shaped by the nature of the aid.
Let me ask you also, Mr. Ambassador, since President Zardari is here in town, and I know you're meeting with him, looking at some events in Pakistan, it's a little unclear to us, I think, sort of who's responsible for what. But certainly some decisions have been made by the Pakistani government. These aren't things that were done to them. They are decisions that they made. There was a decision to release the Imam of the Red Mosque, Abdul Aziz, who then went on television and talked about the need for national Sharia. Similarly, an imam from SWAT was given airtime on television saying the same thing. The deal with SWAT, passive understanding in terms of did not the Pakistani government understand what a potential threat that would pose to their security and to our bilateral relationship. What's your sense of the Pakistani understanding of those, or at least the reactions to those events, and is there some reassessment going on within the Pakistani government about perhaps the wisdom of making such agreements?
Well, there's no way I'm going to defend the release of the Red Mosque leader, but it was not done by the government. It was done by the legislature. The judiciary. And Pakistan has an independent judiciary, and that was in fact the cause of the great political struggle against Musharraf and the considerable political disagreement in mid-March between the two leading political figures in the country. So I share your views. I share your concern. On the radio stations, I will repeat what I said earlier to Congressman Rohrabacher and Congressman Royce. It is inexplicable to me that we didn't have a program to deal with this, to suppress these illegal. These are low-frequency FM stations on the backs of motorcycles and pickup trucks, wandering around SWAT with no counter-programming. We should be suppressing this, and we should be following up with the proper messages. It's a little bit like Rwanda, Mr. Chairman. They're announcing who they're going to behead, and they're terrorizing people. And the bills that are before you include funds to deal with this problem. It's one of the reasons it's so important.
My time is up, and I want to thank you for joining us this morning.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Paulo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Ambassador. I have a couple concerns I want to express. The main concern I have is I was hoping to see maybe a change in our foreign policy from the last administration, but of course we see just more of the same, more nation building, more policing of the world, more involvement, and it just seems like we never learn from our past mistakes. We don't learn from what kind of trouble the Soviets got into, and yet we continue to do the same thing. And even your last statement, it's a grandiose goal that we want to work for a vibrant, modern democracy. Wow, what a dream. But think of how we're doing this. I mean, we label everybody that oppose what we're doing, we call them Taliban, and all of a sudden there are many, many thousands of Pashtuns that are right smack in the middle getting killed by our bombs, and then we wonder why they object to our policies over there. This to me means that we're into this for the long haul. It's going to cost a lot of money, and it's going to cost a lot of lives. And if the members of Congress had ever realized what Iraq would end up costing us in the number of deaths, in the number of dollars, now $1 trillion, they would have been a little more hesitant. They admit that even now. Well, maybe we shouldn't have. But who knows what this is going to end up costing in terms of lives. And the odds of it working are so slim. This is what my great concern is. You know, in 1999, Sharif was the prime minister. And we were supportive of the military coup, and Musharraf comes in and we support him. So now it's said that we will have relationships with Sharif, which everybody knows exactly what that means. It means that we're involved in their elections. That's the way we've done it for so many years. But you know, the Pakistani papers report it as U.S. tapped Sharif to be the next Pakistani prime minister. Now, whether or not we literally can do that, I think we can have a lot of influence. That's what they believe in. How do you win the hearts and minds of these people if we're seen as invaders and occupiers? And here we are just doing nothing more than expanding our role, in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. I don't see any end to it. But my particular question is this. It has to do with some Pashtuns that have been killed by our bombs. I mean, we're bombing a sovereign country. Where do we get the authority to do that? Did the Pakistani government give us written permission? Did the Congress give us written permission to expand the war and start bombing in Pakistan? Why do we as a Congress and as a people and as our representatives in the executive branch just so casually and carelessly expand the war and say, well, today we have to do this, we'll worry about tomorrow? What about our national debt? We have $1.8 billion national debt facing us. We think nothing, $3.5 billion, which will turn out to be tens of billions of dollars after this. So I'd like to know where you stand on this, the innocent killing of Pashtuns. Are they all Taliban, or are there some innocent people being killed?
Congressman Paul, I did not say exactly what you imputed to me, but I have thought a long time about the issues you raise. And you mentioned Iraq. Afghanistan, Pakistan is not Iraq. The reason we are in this area, notwithstanding its immense difficulties, is because the people in this area attacked our country on September 11, 2001, and have stated flatly they intend to do it again. They've done all the other things we mentioned earlier. And therefore, it is not Iraq and it's not Vietnam, despite the fact that many people say it is. It's about defending our country. It is not easy. I agree with you. It's not cheap. And having seen wars on 3 continents, having been shot at for my country, I sure don't feel comfortable in a situation where you ask brave young American men and women to risk their lives and sometimes pay the ultimate sacrifice. However, the President of the United States reviewed everything in regard to this and came to the conclusion not that it's the same policy. We spent the whole meeting today talking about differences, and there are dozens of others. But it's not a same policy, but our goal has to be to defeat al-Qaeda. You cannot let them take over an even larger terrain, move into other parts of the world, and then plan what they're planning, in my view.
The time of the gentleman has expired, and the gentlelady from California, Ms. Woolsey, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador. President Obama recently expressed grave concern about the situation in Pakistan, offering that the very fragile civilian government there does not appear to have the capacity to deliver basic services to the Pakistani people. He further stated that this lack of capacity makes it difficult for the government to gain the support and loyalty of its people. So I'm asking you today, to what extent do you agree with this assessment, and what new actions by the U.S. government might help, and where is the place for smart power, investing in humanitarian needs, in infrastructure, economy, food, so that we can shore up the people? And I believe we could do that, and at the same time, you can correct me if you don't think this is appropriate, hold the government accountable.
Thank you very much for the question. Smart power, which, by the way, is a phrase originated by a person who used to work for me at the UN, Suzanne Nossel, is exactly what this bill is trying to do. It's something we should have done a long time ago. It's using American resources in these areas that go beyond military activities. But, and I know this is difficult for some people, it has to be married up to the use of force and the search for security. And we are using every piece of leverage we have to encourage Pakistan to work with us in Afghanistan and close its own border and deal with its own problems.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, if the ratio to smart investment is 1 to 10, with the 10 being military investment, I don't know how we get where we're going.
I don't think it is 1 to 10 anymore. It was, and if you look at the figures that this committee authorized and your body appropriated for Pakistan, the ratio over the last 10 years, it's pretty hard to understand. But this bill is one of a number of bills now in the Congress to correct that. And that's why I'm here today, to say that although we have differences with some provisos, we think that this is a major step in the right direction.
Well, with Pakistan being a nuclear weapons state, how does that change our interactions? I mean, how complicated does that make the relationship to move to smart power?
I think that prior to your arrival, we discussed that a bit, and I offered to discuss the issue in more detail with the experts in a private session, but it is of immense concern to anyone in the world who cares about stability when any country starts building up a nuclear arsenal. It does not change the fact that in the western part of Pakistan are people who attacked the United States on 9/11 and have stated publicly and repeatedly they intend to do so again. And I, for one, take them at their word. And that is why we're here today. This is, why are we not, and somebody earlier, I think it was Congressman Paul, used the word nation building. Mm-hmm. We are not nation building. Pakistan is a nation. We're helping them strengthen themselves against their enemies. Another one of your colleagues talked about the madrasas. Another example of a missed opportunity. The madrasas grew up with outside funding from the Gulf, and as the New York Times article by Sabrina Tavernese in yesterday's paper front page clearly points out, a brilliant article, the students there are fodder for suicide bombing missions. And there was no counter-programming. That's what you mean by smart power. That's what the administration I'm proud to be part of means by smart power. Mm-hmm. That's what this bill addresses.
Well, do you see a pathway for Pakistan to become a partner for non-proliferation, other than just telling them they can't use what they have, and that they work with us and we work with them and the rest of the world towards non-proliferation?
I don't know. It's a very good question. We are wrestling with that and its related issues now. A very, very fair and good question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
I want to be clear, Mr. Chairman. What I don't know is the precise answer to can they be a partner in non-proliferation. It's not that we don't know anything about this.
I understand. And the record should so reflect. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I thank the chairman, and thank you, Ambassador, for being here and your service. I commend you on your testimony that this is the #1 issue. I think for too long this area has been left unfettered, and I believe the tribal areas have grown. The terrorist threat has grown from out of that region, and it, I worked counterterrorism in the Justice Department. It's pretty clear this is where the 9/11 threat emanates from. When you look at Ramzi Yousef, World Trade Center, his uncle Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the London arrest, this is sort of the epicenter in my view, if you will, and I'm very pleased to hear the focus that is being given in this area. A couple of quick questions. One, last time I was there, I visited with then President Musharraf about education. The madrasas, he had a policy to reform education and to reform the madrasas. That didn't happen. Do you see any progress for that under the new administration, and particularly for women to be educated? And then also, if I could just throw out another issue and let you answer both of these questions. The whole idea of conditioning foreign aid is we're looking at providing about $6.7 billion in military aid to Pakistan. It seems to me that we ought to be looking at ways and working with the administration to condition that upon certain security agreements, and also access to AQ Khan, the master proliferator, who we know proliferated to Iran, Syria, North Korea, and yet we've never had the opportunity to sit down with him and get information from him.
On January 12, 2002, if my memory is correct, President Musharraf gave a widely hailed speech in which he aligned himself with the United States in the war on terror and said he would restore democracy and he would close down the madrasas preaching violence. He did none of the above, and the United States did almost nothing to insist on it. And so we fast forward to 2009, and we go back to the Congresswoman's point about smart power. And I urge you to read the article in yesterday's New York Times front page, because it will astonish you that so little was done. But here we are. We have to start again. On the issue of women, I think everyone in this room knows that for Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and for President Obama, this is a huge issue, and we will do everything we can to promote it in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. It is very important. At the same time, I need to be very clear, going back to earlier comments, while women's rights are very important, we should not be in a position of asking young American men and women to risk their lives on behalf of issues that are not directly related to our national security. Those of us who've served in Indochina and elsewhere, those of us who've seen the combat, understand how that decision should be reserved. And I cannot tell you how important the women's issue is, but I don't want to I've been out there. I talked to the troops in the western deserts west of Kandahar. I've seen them. The unit I spent time with had taken 3 casualties and never seen the enemy. And if they say, why are they fighting? You can't say you're fighting so that women have equal rights. If we do that, we're going to fight in a lot of other countries.
I certainly agree with the.
This is a very nuanced issue. I don't want anyone to think we're diminishing the importance of it or reduce its importance in your legislation. But I don't want people to think, as they did a few years ago, that that's why we're putting troops at risk in Afghanistan. We're there because the people in the western part of the country, some people there, are saying publicly that they intend to attack the U.S. again, and we cannot leave them untouched and unchallenged.
And I agree with that assessment. The issue on conditioning the foreign aid, tying it to security.
Say again, sir.
We have $6.7 billion in military aid. And it seems to me we ought to condition that aid upon certain security arrangements and agreements, and then AQ Khan.
Well, both those issues we addressed at length earlier, but let me just say that it is understandable you want some degree of conditionality, or as the chairman said, accountability. Some of the things in your legislation I hope would be adjusted. The meeting that the chairman is going to have with President Zardari later today is very important in that regard. Our meetings don't begin till tomorrow morning. Secretary Clinton talked about finding the sweet spot between your legitimate and understandable desire and the need to help them quickly. But I do want to underscore that however the final legislation turns out, the goals and motives of the, what I prefer the chairman's phrase, accountability section 206 of the legislation, are the goals themselves are very similar to our own goals. But the methodology is something I would hope we would have a chance to discuss further as you move forward, and this afternoon's meeting will help us do that.
Thank you. The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Sheila Jackson-Lee, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and let me add my appreciation. I was going to begin, Ambassador Holbrooke, by saying I didn't know where to start, but I can start with saluting you as a great public servant and one who consistently has accepted challenges without regard to your personal security, and frankly, I believe we owe you a debt of gratitude and applause. You are now tied inextricably to President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton, and I think that is a dynamic and a very productive team. No nonsense, but balance, and I believe that is extremely important. Let me just quote the former Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto, who I had a chance to speak to before her death, but comments that she made: the next few months are critical to Pakistan's future direction as a democratic state, committing to promoting peace, fighting terrorism, and working for social justice. Democracy is to peace and to undermining the forces of terrorism. She made it clear almost without the ability to see that challenge through. She almost was prophetic because obviously she lost her life, and in the months afterward we are facing these challenges. But I want to try to get to a core set of issues and wondering how we can move forward. For example, you will continuously hear my colleagues mention A.Q. Khan, and I respect that. But I do think as part of our negotiations, we have to probe Pakistan, even though it is not connected, and I believe it should not as we move forward in your position as an envoy, to convince us that Dr. Khan is contained. Those of us who have traveled to Pakistan have heard that stated repeatedly. And as I joined my chairman for a very, very instructive CODEL, I believe it is also key that we emphasize the unifying of the government. We had a chance to meet opposition leaders as well as government leaders, and I think it's crucial that we focus on the unity of the Pakistan government. It speaks to Benazir Bhutto's comment of moving forward and promoting peace. We cannot do it in a separated government. And I appreciate you commenting on that, but let me ask my further question here. I am told, and I'm reading an article that should come out on May 18th in Newsweek, that in fact the military has made some accomplishments through Operation Sherdil. And I'm wondering whether you're aware of that and whether or not those accomplishments can be commented on. They have utilized friendly Taliban. They are working with tribesmen. They're the ones doing their work, similar to the Iraq, Sons of Iraq that we did in Iraq and the United States military did with them. Lastly, I think we should read into the record what the New York Times said. Pakistan's poorest families have turned to madrasas or Islamic schools that feed and house the children. So, Mr. Ambassador, if you would comment on can we not bring some good news out of Pakistan so that Americans know that the people of Pakistan want peace, want security, that these terrorist acts have gone against Pakistan institutions such as the Marriott was owned by a Pakistani, and that we have got to push the government, even as the monies are coming, to put in place alternative schools, not even to wait till our money flows, because obviously they have some good dollars from the donor conference that you were so keen in supporting, and I yield to you. And thank you for your service.
Let me start by thanking you for co-chairing the Pakistan caucus and saying that Secretary Clinton is very grateful that you are going to assist us in helping mobilize more of the resources of the Pakistani-American community. Your colleague Dan Burton is also participating and this is of great personal interest to the Secretary of State and the President.
And it's a great opportunity. The people of America who are Pakistani are very interested in being part of this.
You will recall, Mr. Chairman, that when Secretary Clinton testified, she referred frequently to the Pakistani diaspora, and that has not been done by previous Secretaries of State, and she is very serious about it, and Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee has been very, very supportive of this effort, and I would like to just record that. Now, in regard to the madrasas, you're quoting the article I've already referred to twice, and I do commend it. In regard to the operation you mentioned, I must confess that either I didn't hear its name or I'm not aware of what we're referring to, so I apologize.
It's Operation Shirdil, Shirdil, and it's in the Bajur area, and allegedly there have been some activities by the Pakistani military where they have embraced the tribesmen who are working to fight against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban.
Bajur is where that is going on, and we don't have enough reports to know how well it's doing.
Ambassador, the time of the gentlelady has expired. Perhaps, through writing, there's a way to follow up on a couple of the questions that were not responded to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm told the Ambassador Holbrooke, and I wasn't aware of this, he has to leave at 2 o'clock. Maybe we can squeeze in 3 more people. And
Mr. Chairman, this came up while we were here. The White House asked if I could get right down. I apologize.
Okay, so we will have no more. We will have no time for more than 3 at the most. Questioners, Mr. Burton.
Well, Mr. Chairman, what I'll do is just try to put all my questions together so that we can save some time. There's a great deal of concern, and I don't want to be redundant, but Mr. Ackerman raised the issue about the intelligence operation in Pakistan and how there may be some agents that aren't quite on our side and may be working with the Taliban and maybe double agents. I presume our intelligence agency, the CIA, is working with them to some degree, and I'd like to know, what your assessment of the situation is as far as whether or not we've got some potential enemies in their intelligence operation.
I don't, with great respect, Mr. Congressman, I don't think it would serve the national interest to pursue this line in an open session.
Well, then I would like to attend a closed session where we can get this information. The other thing I'd like to ask is we've skirted around what we would do in the event that the Taliban did take over and move close to these nuclear sites in Pakistan. And I know you have to do this in a closed session, but I'd like to have you explain to the members of the Congress how we're going to protect those and what cooperation you can expect from the military in Pakistan, even if the Taliban were to take over the civil government.
You have a great talent, Congressman, for asking questions that are very sensitive, very tough, and probably ought to be reserved. We already discussed this issue.
Okay.
I think it might be worth a private session if you agree.
And I have one more question, so I won't gobble up any more time. We talked about these madrasas, and the Saudis and the Gulf states have been not only helping build madrasas and create them in Pakistan, but they've done it in other parts of the world. In Canada, I believe some of it's even been done here in the United States. They have a vested interest in making sure that Iran does not get nuclear weapons. And yet, when you start funding operations where terrorists can evolve out of them, you end up maybe getting bitten on the hand yourself. And I don't know if the Saudis have been made aware of that or not, but can you explain real quickly how you're going to stop the money getting into Pakistan and elsewhere so that these madrasas are shut down or slowed down?
Congressman Burton, you're 3 for 3 on questions I think we ought to discuss in private. This is a compliment. These are tough ones, and these are the front edge of what we're working on. Okay. I already addressed that earlier. And I do want to also thank you, as I did Sheila Jackson Lee, for your leadership with the Pakistan American community and for your readiness to participate in the important meeting coming up this weekend.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I hope we'll have a classified meeting.
Would you
as quickly as
yield?
possible.
Would you yield, Mr. Burton?
Yes.
We are very limited on time.
I'm going to ask a question. I just want to make sure that we all can join in that classified briefing. Thank you.
Oh, yes, I would not convene a classified briefing just for Mr. Burton. But I would give him the first three questions. Absolutely. We will follow that up. And now the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Holbrooke. Welcome. I want to just make a point because I think you did refer to the fact of the nuclear issue, that we would discuss some of that in private session. But I want to make this statement in public in reference to that because regardless of all the other issues that come up, paramount on the minds and the hearts of not just the American people, but the people across the world, is that this situation in Pakistan is unique because Pakistan has these nuclear weapons.
And
now, we have
Al
before us
nuclear weapons in the center and Al Qaeda in the west.
absolutely, and I want to get to both of those, but I do want to say that we're giving them or approaching to give them close to $9 billion. Our aid is coming. It's very important. It's somewhat of a fragile situation. We've got this nuclear issue. It might not be improper to have some consideration of requirements on this aid tied to a capacity for the United States to have some joint cooperation with making sure that these nuclear weapons are secured. And I don't want you to have to respond to that. I just want you to know that there's some very strong feelings that we make sure. And I think that what the world population is looking to, not for Pakistan to answer that question if their nuclear weapons are secure from that, but there must be a much more reliable source, and none more reliable than that the United States itself to say, yes, world, we have these in control, the nuclear capacity of Pakistan is under control. That will give the world a great sigh of relief. And I believe, judging from the information we have, that we're not there yet, and maybe we can make that a condition of our efforts. Going back to Al Qaeda, what is the end game now? We are very fearful that we could be in for a long slog here, very reminiscent of Vietnam. One of the mistakes we have is that we don't have an exit strategy. We don't have an end strategy. There is a cluster, there is a disagreement on what that mission is. Could you very quickly state to us, in your just succinct words? The reason I say that is because there is considerable thought within the Congress that we have just a year here. We have a year here to see what it is we could do over there in this administration. So I guess what I'm looking at is within that year, can we clearly define a mission now? Is that simply Al Qaeda? Is it getting Pakistan stable in the region? And what is our end game and our exit strategy?
Mr. Scott, we can define the objective very clearly, and President Obama did that very clearly in his major speech and many other times. It's to destroy, disrupt, and dismantle Al Qaeda, which pose a threat to us. But to give a precise timetable is to put in motion the seeds of your own failure. You say 1 year, and they'll say, great, we'll wait you out. This is a difficult struggle. It will take an unspecifiable amount of time. I fully understand the desire of the American people and the Congress for a time limit and an exit strategy. But there's a difference between an exit strategy and an exit timetable. And we have defined our strategy, but we certainly can't put a time on it.
And in terms of Al Qaeda, and in terms of the Taliban, in terms of the fact that is it an accurate statement from the reports that they are within 60 miles of the capital city?
Not quite 60, but very close when they took Bunair, but they've been driven out of Bunair, and the Pakistani army is now trying to push them back in Swat. so it's more like 100. But the difference between 60 and 100 isn't that significant. The importance is who has the momentum. Until yesterday, the momentum did not appear to be in the right hands. The Army has now begun major offensives, which Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee alluded to, and we will have to wait and see how it goes. I hope you will address these questions to President Zardari.
We certainly will. And finally, I have 8 seconds. Well, I have no seconds. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Could we have one more?
Of course.
Mr. Costa from California, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador. I appreciate your good work. You've drawn a very difficult assignment in your portfolio. I'm a very pragmatic realist, as I suspect you are, and you deal with the cards you're dealt, and I know that's what you're dealing with, both in Afghanistan and Pakistan. I was with the chairman in this last visit to Pakistan as well as India, and I've been to Afghanistan and Pakistan twice in the last 2 years. Afghanistan first. How do we succeed there, in which corruption seems to be, if not endemic, a way of life, and we've got the problems with the opium trade, and nothing we've done so far seemingly has been able to penetrate at the local level, although I know there's been a reset in our policy there.
How do we succeed? Well, we're putting into place a huge array of different plans. This bill is one of them, because this bill significantly restructures the priorities. And I think it's very clear that we're trying to change our strategy.
To certain that the money that we provide actually gets to the local levels and not...
Am I certain? I'm pretty certain that the money in the past did not get very much of it got down there. We want to change that. One point, Mr. Chairman, I didn't make earlier is that I am now personally reviewing all aid projects for both countries, and I've been rejecting a lot of them precisely on the grounds of Mr. Costa's question, because I didn't see that it was getting out there. Some of the money was dribbled away to contractors in the Washington area or elsewhere. Then it was subcontract in the field. There wasn't sufficient end-use checks. We're restructuring everything. The other day, we rejected a project for support of women's NGOs in Afghanistan because it was going through contractors, and we said, let's put this money directly in the hands of the ambassador so it can be, for the same purpose, $30 million. We want to tighten that up. We want to come back to you in a year and say that accountability in our government has gotten better, not just the accountability you're interested in with the Pakistanis.
I appreciate that, Mr. Ambassador, and there's some local investments from California that have provided monies for construction of hospitals and schools, and I'd like to pursue that on a separate line of question.
Delighted.
Pakistan, same thing. I read the article that you've referenced twice now. 2 different kinds of Pakistans, as the article pointed out. A third or 40% urban, secular, educated, the other 60% plus rural, poor, and not much education. And yet the 60 years that we know of the history of Pakistan as a government has been primarily run by the military with intervals of democracy. Through all that time, corruption has run fairly consistent. What are your milestones in these negotiations with our Pakistani allies? I agree with you. Timelines don't make sense, but it seems to me there has to be milestones that they need to reach.
We are working with your committee on these, what you called milestones. I think my colleagues in the administration like the word metrics, but we all know what we mean. I've always had a feeling that if we're succeeding, we're going to know it.
And the question hasn't been asked, but it's been inferred to. We hope the current government well and that they are successful. What's our backup plan if by the end of this year we're dealing with another government in Pakistan?
If we have a backup plan, we're going to of the sort you mean, we're just going to publicly undermine the government. Asif Ali Zardari is the democratically elected president of the second largest Muslim country in the world, the fifth largest country in the world. He's coming to meet you all this afternoon, and he should be treated as the leader of a country who vitally needs our support and whose success is directly related to our most vital national interests. And to address your question, as an American official, would be only to undermine that goal.
I appreciate that. I understand that.
But I do want to underscore again, this is a country that has had over half its history in military. We don't want that.
The time of the gentleman has expired. We have one last person here. Want to try? Do you think as you're bundling up to leave, Mr. Ellison could throw out a question or two to you?
I just have one question, Mr. Ambassador, and like everybody has lauded you, I want to join in that, but I won't waste time doing it because I know you feel good about the work you've done. I'd like to see us connect aid to access to nuclear scientists, to redeploying away from India to more in the more vital areas, and a long list of other things we could connect aid to. But how does that make President Zardari look in the eyes of the people who want to defeat him? Do they use it to say, see, you're just a toy of the West, and then we're going to, and sort of use that to sort of undermine what motion he could make?
Great question. President Zardari has often been accused of being too pro-American. And please bear that in mind. He's paid a price for being pro-American, while some Americans don't appreciate how much he is trying to do the right thing for his country. And I'm glad you asked that question as a scene setter for your own meetings with him today.
And the only thing I'd say, because I do think that's a very important question, but we just have spent 9 years not conditioning, not holding accountable, and what have we gotten for that? And the one thing Musharraf wasn't was a toy of the Americans, but in and of itself, that didn't solve the fundamental question. Ambassador Holbrooke, I very much appreciate your being here. I know this is an incredibly busy week and an incredibly busy month and an incredibly busy life, and you have a huge job ahead of you. No one's better able to do it than you, and we thank you for being here. We are going to have a second panel now, even if it's just for me. But the second panel I'm going to introduce as they come forward. Today we have several noted experts on Pakistan. Lisa Curtis is a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, where she focuses on America's economic, security, and political relationships with South Asia. Before joining Heritage in August 2006, she worked on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee as a professional staff member for 3 years for then-Chairman Senator Lugar. From 2001 to 2003, she served as a senior advisor in the State Department's South Asia Bureau. She has also worked as an analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency in the late 1990s. Christine Fair is a senior political scientist with the RAND Corporation. Prior to rejoining RAND, she served as a political officer to the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan and as a senior research associate in the United States Institute of Peace. Her research focuses upon security competition between India and Pakistan, Pakistan's internal security, the causes of terrorism in South Asia, and U.S. strategic relations with India and Pakistan. She is a member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the Council on Foreign Relations, and is the managing editor of India Review. Daniel Markey is a senior fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations. His areas of specialization include security and governance in South Asia, international conflict, theories of international relations, and U.S. foreign policy. From 2003 to 2007, he held the South Asia portfolio on the policy planning staff at the Department of State. Prior to government service, Dr. Markey taught courses in the politics department at Princeton University and served as the executive director of Princeton's research program in international security. And while our audience is small, it's very interested. So, you know, you could talk to a lot of people who wouldn't care. You got a few people who really do. So, Ms. Curtis, why don't you start? Yeah, and try and summarize your opening statement in about 5 minutes.
Okay. Chairman Berman, Congressman Burton, thank you very much for inviting me here today to testify on this very important topic. Pakistan is being roiled by a well-armed and well-organized insurgency, pushing for the establishment of strict Islamic law, beginning in the country's northwest frontier province, but with the long-term goal of provoking a nationwide Islamic revolution. Although the collapse of the Pakistani state may not be imminent, as some have recently suggested, the government's surrender of the Swat Valley to pro-Taliban militants was a major victory for the extremists seeking to carve out pockets of influence throughout the country. Islamabad's decision to allow the implementation of a parallel Islamic court system in Malakand division of the NWFP, which includes Swat Valley, demonstrates the weakness of the Pakistan government and military in the face of the militant onslaught. The Pakistan military had deployed some 12,000 troops to Swat Valley for 18 months in 2007 and 2008 before surrendering to the militants. The surrender occurred despite the overwhelming vote in favor of the secular political party Awami National Party in the February 2008 elections, demonstrating that the people of the region do not support the extremist agenda, but are merely acquiescing in the absence of support from the government to counter the militants. Washington has repeatedly warned Pakistani officials about the danger of appeasing the militants through peace deals that confer legitimacy on them and help them consolidate control over ever-increasing parts of the province. Pakistani officials have rejected Washington's concerns, accusing U.S. officials of hyping the threat and or misreading the local ground situation. Pakistani officials have also glossed over the fact that the establishment of a parallel Islamic court system will have dire human rights consequences for average Pakistanis, mainly women and girls. Events over the last 2 weeks, however, may have finally awakened some Pakistani officials to the downsides of the Swat peace deal. The leader of the pro-Taliban militants, Sufi Muhammad, declared in a recent interview that democracy is not permissible under Sharia law, revealing the militants' ultimate objective of undermining Pakistan's democratic institutions nationwide. And just 1 week after Pakistani President Asif Ali Zardari approved the Swat Valley peace agreement, following passage of a parliamentary resolution urging him to do so, the Taliban took over the neighboring district of Bunair. The Taliban subsequently agreed to pull out of Bunair on April 24th after Pakistan deployed paramilitary troops to the region. That same day, Chief of Army Staff General Kiani sent a warning to the militants that the Army would not allow them to impose their way of life on the civil society of Pakistan. The statement was a positive first step in clarifying Pakistani policy toward the militants, but it must now be followed by sustained and consistent action based on a comprehensive civil-military plan to counter the militants' objectives. Pakistani civilian leaders have been too slow to awaken to the threat before them and too willing to sacrifice their constituents to the brutal policies of the Taliban. For Pakistan to fend off the growing extremist influence in the country, civilian leaders need to highlight the brutality of the pro-Taliban militants, demonstrating they are forcing a way of life on Pakistani citizens that is alien to their own historical traditions of Islam and aspirations for constitutional democracy. The struggle is certainly Pakistan's to fight, but the U.S. can support those Pakistanis standing up for the preservation of democratic institutions and promotion of tolerance, pluralism, rule of law, and the development of civil society. Both the Pakistan Enduring Assistance and Cooperation Enhancement Act of 2009, the Peace Act, recently introduced in this chamber, and the Enhanced Partnership with Pakistan Act of 2009, introduced yesterday in the Senate, demonstrate the U.S. interest in developing a broad-based, long-term partnership with Pakistan. The Peace Act provides comprehensive details on the shape of future economic aid to Pakistan, focusing on a range of areas, including strengthening the parliament, the judicial system, and law enforcement sectors. The Peace Act also addresses the need for strong oversight and accountability in the provision and distribution of this aid, and to ensure that it's not wasted or abused. Both bills also contain language calling for greater accountability with regard to future military assistance to Pakistan. These measures would require Islamabad to permanently break the links between its security services and the Afghan Taliban and other extremist groups. While some have raised concerns that such conditions will discourage rather than encourage Pakistani cooperation against terrorists, others note that we must begin to develop leverage with our large-scale aid programs and ensure that U.S. taxpayer money does not perversely contribute to undermining U.S. objectives in Afghanistan. Ambassador Holbrooke talked about reaching that sweet spot, and I would just point out that that sweet spot would recognize Pakistan's genuine security concerns, but also make clear that the U.S. will not tolerate dual policies toward terrorists. While seeking to stiffen Pakistani resolve against the Taliban, the U.S. must at the same time shore up Pakistani capabilities. To this end, it is appropriate that CENTCOM Commander General Petraeus be given the latitude and flexibility he needs immediately to strengthen Pakistani capabilities to fight insurgents through the proposed Pakistan Counterinsurgency Capability Fund that would allocate $400 million in this fiscal year to build the capacity of Pakistan's security forces and assist with humanitarian relief efforts in post-combat zones. While the PCCF for this year has no specific conditions attached to it, the U.S. Congress should find some mechanism to ensure that the PCCF funding for future years will be contingent on whether the 2009 tranche has contributed to strengthening both Pakistan's capability and will to fight terrorism.
I think, Ms. Kritz, could you just wind up?
Yep.
Very good, Bowen.
And
Got it.
lastly, the U.S. should dedicate diplomatic resources to helping the leaders in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India develop a different security paradigm for the region that allows them to focus on containing dangerous non-state actors and enhancing cooperation and regional integration. And lastly, while the U.S. should do everything possible to stabilize Pakistan, Washington's best efforts alone will not be sufficient for the task. We need Pakistan's leaders to also stand up and demonstrate they're willing to stand up against Taliban advances in their own country. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Fair.
Thank you, Chairman Berman and Congressman Burton and esteemed colleagues for the opportunity to participate in today's hearings on the future of U.S.-Pakistan relations. The finding that the U.S. requires a, quote, balanced, integrated, countrywide strategy that targets assistance throughout Pakistan and does not disproportionately focus on the military or specific area or province, unquote, is a very welcome departure from past policies. Indeed, there's wide concurrence that perhaps the only path to a stable Pakistan at peace with itself and with its neighbors is one that is firmly controlled by capable civilians rather than one that is dominated by the military directly or indirectly. I am similarly heartened by the explicit interest in ensuring transparency and effective accountability of all U.S. assistance and reimbursement to the country. While many of the provisions to strengthen the national parliament, the political parties, and other civilian institutions, as well as civil society, seem appropriately configured and indeed vital to rehabilitating a civilian-controlled Pakistan, I will focus the balance of my remarks upon the areas that concern me most. First, all of the efforts in this legislation presuppose effective partnering with Pakistanis truly vested in change. Without such collaborators for change, it is doubtful that these proposed efforts will fructify. Yet in all honesty, actual reformers, in my view, seem few and far between. Some of the proposed areas of activity, such as educational curricular reform, will likely be staunchly resisted on nationalist grounds, even if they say yes in the presence of U.S. interlocutors. Pakistanis have consistently expressed considerable concern about U.S. efforts to, quote, de-Islamize, unquote, Pakistan schools. So rather than dictating programmatic areas of reform, a better approach might be a required consultative approach with Pakistani counterparts to identify areas of reform and a joint plan of mutual resourcing and commitment. Without upfront Pakistani commitment and buy-in, I'm simply unconvinced that these programs, as described, will actually have effect. And I'd like to say, on a side, the U.S. does some things very good, encouraging competition. The World Bank has had very interesting results in the efficacy of private schooling, and maybe we can talk about this more in the question of answering. There simply is no data that support a preponderance of students going in madrasas, or that madrasa students are more poor on the average than public school students. So there's a lot of data that simply doesn't support the most hair-raising of accounts that we hear in the media, and I'm happy to talk about that. I've done a lot of work on that area. I'm also concerned that the United States may not have the capacity to execute such a capacious program responsibly and with effective outcomes given the human capital challenges within the U.S. mission in Pakistan, the constricted security environment that constrains them, the very real danger to U.S. personnel in Pakistan, and a potential paucity of credible Pakistani reformers dedicated to the kinds of capacity building you have envisioned in this legislation. In addition, the USAID business model of relying upon layers of contractors to deliver services may result in much of the funding returning to the United States, suboptimal outcomes, and greater disappointment in the failure to deliver services to the Pakistani polity. What I do not see in this legislation is any provision to enable Pakistan to increase its own ability to raise domestic revenue. Long-term aid aimed to help the Pakistani government deliver services undermines the social contract between the government and the governed, because the government has few incentives to raise revenue and redistribute these funds as services, or even to make hard choices about budgetary commitments. And I'm talking specifically about the trade-off between human capital development and military expenditures. There are simply few reasons why Pakistan cannot, in the near term, learn to pay for itself, and it should be encouraged to do so. The bill also pays scant regard to Pakistan's police. Despite the robust counterinsurgency literature that consistently finds that police win insurgencies, not armies, and we're learning this also in Afghanistan, this legislation simply doesn't pay adequate attention to the Pakistan police. Yet, unlike the Army, which has shown considerable resistance to change its doctrine towards one that is more coin-inclined and less inclined to be ready to fight India, Pakistan's police have actually tried to reform themselves. Yet they are obstructed by Pakistan's bureaucrats and political leadership. Yet the police are poorly trained, poorly equipped, undermanned, and under fire from the insurgents. Quite frankly, they are sitting ducks. My most significant concern stems from the provisions in Section 206. The majority of the proposed security assistance is aimed at buttressing Pakistan's ability to effectively eliminate insurgent and terrorist threats. While I support the sense of the House that Pakistan must be held to account on nuclear proliferation and supporting militant groups terrorizing the region, there is little likelihood that Pakistan will acquiesce to stated demands. And this puts the United States in a very awkward position of having to once again execute waiver authority to allow funding to continue. It continues a well-worn cycle of the United States bending its commitment to accommodate the importance of dealing with Pakistan. And quite frankly, it undermines Pakistan's interpretation of U.S. intentions of how serious these issues are. I prefer a benchmark or a metrics-based approach which actually tries to achieve the same goals that you've identified in this legislation, but one which provides a mechanism for for verification, data that will be used to prove compliance. And we can talk about more, perhaps in the Q&A, but I think a data-driven, process-oriented, benchmark-focused process has greater transparency and will be more easy to communicate to the Pakistanis if, after concerted, collaborative effort, Pakistan continues to fail to meet our expectations, and a revision of security assistance is important. Thank you very much.
Mr. Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Congressman Burton, and members of the committee for this opportunity to discuss U.S. policy towards Pakistan. My remarks today are based on my written testimony, which is in the form of a report that was released by the Council on Foreign Relations about a week ago and has been submitted to the record. I think we're all familiar, and we have become more familiar over the course of the last discussion, with the numerous policy challenges that we face in Pakistan. We've got al-Qaeda, we've got Taliban, we've got India tensions, we've got nuclear problems, we've got a weak state, just to mention a few. But what worries me the most, and what I think doesn't get quite as much as attention as it deserves, is the need to focus on what I would consider to be a next generation of challenges, the longer-term threats that we face from Pakistan. And here I would identify for you the fact of the matter is that the next generation of extremists and of globally interconnected terrorist groups are likely to come from Pakistan. Over half of Pakistan's population are teenagers. They suffer from poor education, from weak economic opportunities, and they're surrounded by this pervasive sense of anti-Americanism that is seeping into their lives and informing their actions. So all the threats that we currently perceive coming from Afghanistan are there in spades in Pakistan. And so the implication of this, and what I draw in my report, is that the United States should shift its strategic focus, not just from Iraq to Afghanistan, not just to link Afghanistan and Pakistan, but to go one step further and place Pakistan at the center of our strategic concerns. And I think we need to recognize that in doing so, we face an incredibly difficult, complicated, and probably very costly challenge for the United States looking ahead. So in order to do this, I try to identify what I consider to be the best strategy moving ahead. And this is a long-term strategy. It's based on two central pillars. The first of these is what I would consider to be the inducement of allies and of partners within Pakistan's civilian political leadership, within its military, and within wider society. We should use our U.S. assistance to empower those elements within Pakistan that already see their interests in similar ways to the way that we do, and to make them more effective at achieving those interests. That's pillar one. Pillar two is that we should be seeking to reshape the strategic environment of the region as understood by those actors within the region. We should use our assistance, our military operations, and our diplomacy to create new incentives for those actors to convince Pakistan's political and military leadership of the benefits of working with us and of the costs inherent to working or opposing our efforts. Now, at best, these are going to be long-term goals. They're probably not going to make rapid progress, even if we spend $1.5 billion a year, even if we place 60,000 or more U.S. and NATO forces into Afghanistan. They are going to require patience, and they're going to especially require patience within the next 3 to 5 years. But remember, the point that I made earlier, the thing that concerns me the most about Pakistan is not just the urgent threats that we're all very aware of, but it's this next generation of challenges that we're likely to see coming from Pakistan. Now, in the next 3 to 5 years, until Pakistan is capable, I think, of being a more effective partner to meet those urgent threats, we will continue to need to use the forceful U.S. military and intelligence operations in Afghanistan along the Pakistan border. I think we all know what we're talking about here. But in conducting those operations, I would suggest that we need to do our best, to do the least possible to jeopardize the prospects for a longer-term partnership. So let me conclude by making a number of points about how this strategy that I've just laid out in very brief terms relates to pending legislation. First of all, I support this type of U.S. military and civilian programming of the sort that you've put forward in H.R. 1886. And I would recommend, in addition to that, that the committee encourage the administration to go one step further, to fund adequately the expansion of U.S. civilian capacity to operate effectively throughout Pakistan. The concerns about security that currently dog U.S. operations in Pakistan are so debilitating that I think it will be almost impossible, unless we ramp up our operations there, to adequately formulate or implement the kinds of programming that we'd like to see in the country. Secondly, I support military assistance and diplomatic commitment over the long haul to Afghanistan. And this relates to my desire to try and shape the strategic environment in the region. We have to convince the Pakistanis that we are committed to seeing the project in Afghanistan through to the end, to make it clear that their strategy of hedging, which has led them to support various groups in the past, will not work. Now, I know I'm out of time, so let me just say what I oppose, and then we can go on at length later. I oppose legislation that's based on conditions that would curtail assistance in the future. We do not want to repeat the mistakes of the past, where the implication of Pakistanis not doing what we ask them to do is cutting off our assistance and further damaging the relationship. I oppose U.S. diplomatic statements that undermine confidence among Pakistanis and make it more likely that Pakistanis who are the elite, the intellectual class, are likely to believe that their country is really going down the tubes and make it more likely that they themselves will leave the country. And finally, I oppose the use, and this is something that seems to not have come up very regularly, I oppose the continued use of coalition support funds as a particular mechanism for funding the Pakistani army. I believe that this has been a very frustrating mechanism for us, and it's been very frustrating for the Pakistanis. To the extent that we're looking for a way to improve our partnership, I find it baffling that we would continue with this particular kind of mechanism. We need to find a different way, and I'm sort of surprised that this hasn't been a centerpiece of our revision of the kinds of assistance programming that we do with the Pakistanis. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much. I'm going to temporarily turn over the chair to Mr. Ellison, who will yield himself time to start the questioning. I'll be back.
Let me thank the panel, and I'll yield myself 5 minutes. My first question is the question I left off with Ambassador Holbrooke. What impact does linking aid have on the ability of Pakistani leadership to advance the issues that we care about here? How important is it to be concerned about how opponents of the government are going to paint the government if the government accepts a deal with the United States for aid that conditions things like redeploying away from India, improving relations with India, things like that? Ms. Fair, why don't you start?
Well, as I said in my written statement, they simply won't do it. And then we're going to be put in the awkward position of using the waiver. And so I actually have a fairly strong opposition to putting conditionalities that we can say right off the bat they won't acquiesce to, forcing us to use this waiver. And if you look at the long expanse of U.S. history of engaging Pakistan, we've always done this. We have legislative commitments, and we always overwrite it.
So Ms. Fair, are you saying we keep in the conditions but take out the waiver? Or are you saying we don't put in the waiver or the conditions?
Well, this is a philosophical question in some measure, but I actually do believe that we cannot be paying the Pakistanis to participate in eliminating some terrorists while still continuing to foster and encourage other terrorist groups. So I actually do support the idea of conditionalities, but I really think it should be process-based, it should be evidence-based. The conditionalities, as stated, can be finessed to the point of futility or simply refused, forcing us to put in a waiver. I also think that it has to be done collaboratively with the Pakistanis.
Thank you. That's a good point you closed on. Mr. Markey, do you want to weigh in here?
Yeah, I would agree with the tenor of your question, which is essentially we are playing into a complex political debate within Pakistan. We need to recognize that our words and our legislation have implications for how Pakistanis and Pakistan's leaders interact with their own people. and we can do things that will undermine our very partners. And I think that that is, unfortunately, even though I share all of the goals that are in this legislation, I think that is how it is playing out in Pakistan's very complicated political environment. We need to simply recognize this and deal with it. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't require things, but we probably shouldn't require them in these forms. And at the very least, we shouldn't implicate or imply that we will cut off assistance and repeat the mistakes of the past of severing the relationship if what we try first doesn't work.
Ms. Curtis?
I have a dissenting view, sir. I think the U.S. needs to find some leverage. We have tried inducements. 7 years later, $11 billion later, we still have General Petraeus telling us it's a very mixed picture from the Pakistan military. Yes, we are getting more cooperation along the border, yet we still see unhelpful links to the Taliban. So I would just repeat my view that I think the time has come to demonstrate that we won't tolerate these dual policies. Number two,
You know, Ms. Curtis, if I had more than 5 minutes, I wouldn't mind letting you
sure.
continue on. Well, thanks a lot. Well, let me move on. You know, in my own district in Minneapolis, when we discuss Pakistan, and we often do, one of the issues that comes up is the unmanned aerial vehicles. I wonder if each one of you would offer your assessment as to the net utility. I mean, I know they have a benefit, I know they have a detriment, but what is the net utility of these, the use of these unmanned vehicles, and how might we, as Congress, move forward to make them effective where there can be and to diminish civilian casualties, which have been linked to them in a significant way? Why don't we start with Ms. Curtis, since we left off with her last time?
Yes, well, I think there has been success in our counterterrorism efforts from the drone strikes. We've heard that we've been able to make more of an impact in disrupting the al-Qaeda leadership in the last 9 months from our drone strikes than we have since 9/11. So I think we need to just take account of that. On the other hand, I think the drone strikes, while they can address short-term risks, they are not a long-term strategy, and they can undermine our long-term goals. So we need to assess whether, in moving forward, they will actually undermine our longer-term counterterrorism goals.
Ms. Fair?
Yeah, I have a very similar view. I will say that we actually are under this belief that Pakistanis uniformly reject drone strikes. I think this is an empirical question. There's actually surveys right now being done by IRI. I have a survey in the field that will come out in June that actually assesses this. The Ariana Institute released a poll of people in FATA. Actually, people in FATA, according to those data, welcome the drone strikes. So my experience in going to Pakistan over the last year is that the drone discourse has changed. People who believe that there are terrorists in FATA do not seem to oppose them as much as we think they do. The problem is that many people don't believe that terrorists live in FATA.
I'm sorry, Ms. Fair. Ms. Markey?
Yeah, I agree with much of what has been said. I would only add one point. That is that as these strikes have been used with accelerating frequency, there is some evidence, according to certain sources, that some of the individuals who are most targeted by them have moved to other parts of Pakistan. This is discouraging and potentially quite destabilizing because the other parts of Pakistan are further into Pakistan, and if Pakistan's stability is a central concern of the United States, then the further use of this particular tactic may prove counterproductive over the longer term.
Okay, let's talk education for a moment. Personally, I'll just express my own bias. I wish that we in the United States would separate this talk about Islam and Muslims and all this stuff from the other problems of terrorism. When you link them, you just make every Muslim a little nervous that you're coming after them. And so I think they should be delinked. I think you can carry on the conversation without implicating religion. But let me just say that the madrasas, if they didn't, of course, a lot of negative things have come from them, but not all of them. And also, it's important to also point out that they're the only option for much of the Pakistani poor. What can we do to not sort of put education versus Islam, but education and Islam? And let me just make this last final comment, and that is, this is a Muslim country. You know, we have to respect the fact that this is not the United States. This is another country. And we shouldn't, our goal should not be to make it a little United States in the East. And I also just want to say that when you look at some of these pictures of some of these kids reciting Quran, they do not know what they're saying. They know the phonetics of the Arabic alphabet and can sort of say the sounds that are presented on the page, but they don't know what that passage means. So if somebody who has a nasty political motive says, kill the infidel, they're like, well, that must be what it says because this respected person said this what it says and I can't read it. Would you all react to some of that, Ms. Fair?
Thank you. You really hit the nail on the head. I do a lot of work on madrasas. A couple of points. The data do not support that madrasas are the vestige of the poor. In fact, if you look at data, madrasas have more wealthy children in them than public schools do. So I always encourage people, look at what the data say. The World Bank, as well as Pakistani researchers, have done this. Second, I wish the U.S. would stop harping on the madrasa problem. Pakistan's a Muslim country. It needs ulama, and it undercuts the efforts of actual reformers within the system who want to produce ulama that are relevant to a modernizing country. Now, the work of those reformers has been undermined because they look like U.S. puppets. Secondly, and related to that, the work of Quentin Torwitz and others actually, including my own public survey work, finds that people who are actually more Islamic, i.e. educated in Islam, are prepared to resist the recruiter's message. It's the people who, as you noted, are unable to engage the ill-advised militant recruiter to say, actually, this isn't Islam. It's actually the deracinated, if I can use that word in this context, and unknowledgeable people who are most vulnerable. So I actually think there's other strategies that we can discuss, and that's why in my written testimony, we should get out of the racket of telling Pakistanis how to run their schools. If Canada were to tell us what we should be teaching, we'd have a problem. We should do what we do best, and that's foster excellence through competition. And there are many people in Pakistan that are interested in educational options, and we should really be exploring those people that want to partner with us rather than dictating an educational agenda that's born in Washington.
If either one of the other panelists want to respond, that'll be my last question. Mr. Curtis.
I just agree that the majority of madrasas in Pakistan are not producing terrorists, and there are legitimate madrasas training clerical leaders. What we need to do is hone in on the real problem, which are those madrasas that are supporting terrorism, like the Haqqani madrasa in the tribal areas, a couple of unhelpful ones in Karachi, the Lashkar-e-Taiba complex in Muridke, Pakistan. I mean, we know where the unhelpful ones are, and that's what we need to.
Ms. Curtis, for the record, can you simply tell us, for the record, what the word madrasa translates to in English?
Islamic seminary? No.
Ms. Fair?
It literally means school.
It literally means school. Thank you for saying that. I just want to let Mr. Markey respond.
Just very briefly, the focal points for the United States' strategy should be quality education, as Chris Fair said, and training camps. I think we can eliminate the madrasa point and simply say anywhere that there are training camps where extremists are preaching and training for violent acts should be targets for U.S. focus. It doesn't need to be linked.
And now we'll recognize Mr. Dan Burton, or Congressman Dan Burton from Indiana. Thank you for your indulgence, sir.
You know, I've been in the Congress for a long time and on this committee for 26 years now. And the one thing I've learned is you can't make the rest of the world over in our image. And in many cases, you can't create a democracy, which we would all like to see, because of the result of that democracy. And right now in Pakistan, it appears as though the Taliban, should they be successful, we would end up with a government that we don't want because we tried to create a government the way we want it to be. So my questions are, first of all, it's obvious that the young people in that country are a majority, and they are in large part being trained by, I guess, the Taliban and other radical elements. And the money is not there for these schools to be built or created that would teach them things other than what's being taught in radical mosques. So what's the answer? They don't have the money over there, as I understand it, to go out in the countryside and make sure that the people who live out there can get a good education if they don't go to those schools in most cases. So how do we get that money out there for the educational purposes from your point of view? Go ahead.
I would say there is a resource issue, and this has been persistent for some time. But when I talk to USAID officials on the education issue in particular, they will say a large part of this is an organizational problem, and it's a problem of politics in Pakistan. Even when resources have been available, they've been siphoned off to purposes other than the public education system. So the problem is not simply dollars and cents. It's the adequate implementation of programming, either by the United States, by NGOs, or by Pakistani government itself. And so my recommendation is that if we want to have a better window into what is actually happening on the ground and encourage quality education, then we need to have U.S. and U.S.-linked officials based in Pakistan who can get out there and see for themselves what's actually happening. And right now, we lack that. We lack that both because we don't have enough people there and because they're not safe to get around. And that's a critical gap in our capacity in Pakistan.
You indicate that money that goes over there for educational purposes is not reaching its target. Is that because of corruption in the government?
That's often been the case, yes.
So how do we get that educational money to its proper use? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a dissenting view. I really want to go back to the data. The World Bank has looked at this repeatedly. Families who have no other opportunities but madrasas are more likely to opt out of the public school system. We have to get rid of this myth that they're the school of last resort. Families actually choose, in many cases, to send their child to a madrasa because it confers religious benefits, even while they send other children to public or private schools. So the first thing we have to do about education is really get rid of the myths and look at the data. Second, as Dr. Markey noted, it's not necessarily a resource constraint issue. It's a corruption issue. You have many ghost schools. And let me go back to the point that I made about private schools. The World Bank has consistently found that private schools can deliver a better education at lower cost. And the reason is you don't have ghost schools. You don't have teacher absenteeism. So we need to really rethink this educational issue.
That really doesn't answer the question about how we get the money to its intended purpose so we can stop these young people being indoctrinated in many cases with a radical approach to Islam.
Sir, let me tell you, Lashkar-e-Taiba does not recruit its terrorists from madrasas. This is a fiction. Your average Lashkar-e-Taiba terrorist has a 10-year attainment. That's approximately 5 years more than the average Pakistani. So this idea that terrorists are all poor and indoctrinated from madrasas is an empirical falsity. We have to help Pakistan develop better education and employment opportunities across the board. We know the bad madrasas, and let me tell you, they're really training camps. I've been to numerous madrasas all over Pakistan. We need training camp-focused policy, not madrasa-focused policy.
And that's my point. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, I agree that we need to focus on the public education system, but we also need to get the Pakistan government to increase its share of GDP that it spends on education. I've heard from numerous USAID officials, we've put a lot of money into the education system in Pakistan, but unless we are matched with the Pakistan government, we're not going to be able to make the whole scale change.
Since there's corruption in administration after administration and the money's siphoned off for other purposes, what do we have to do? Go through NGOs, work out a deal with the government that we're going to help build schools that aren't radicalized by sending people in there through a NGO? And you mentioned that there's a real security problem.
Private schools, I think we really should look at. There are a number of very good private schools. They have the advantage of aggregating interest. They only happen when there's an actual demand, and they're very. And the other issue with girls' schooling, you need to have schools that are close to the girls' home. Otherwise, the family won't send them. So while we should certainly encourage the Pakistanis to, I really like Lisa's suggestion. Without absolutely partnered Pakistani interests, this is going to go nowhere. USAID will tell you they can't find where the $100 million that they gave them went. The money has simply disappeared. But there are a number of private sector schools, and we do this so well. Why can't we partner with private sector schools in Pakistan or give scholarship support to other private sector schools?
That's the question I'm asking.
I think we should look at this. It's time to be creative.
That's what I'd like to have is some conclusion on how we get the money to for its proper purposes. And if we're not, then we shouldn't be sending that money over in the first place. I want to ask two more questions, Mr. Chairman. I'll let them answer those all together. First of all, the Gulf and the Saudis and the Gulf states have been sending a lot of money in there for these madrasas, and they've been using that money in other parts of the world as well. I'll agree that most of the mosques, the vast majority of the mosques, don't teach radicalism, but there are those that do. And the money that's coming in from Saudi Arabia and from the Gulf states, they're very wealthy because of our oil money. How do we make sure that that's not going for radicalization of the young people there in Pakistan? Go ahead.
Well, I think we have to make the Pakistan government accountable for what's happening within its own borders. And if there are radical madrasas or training camps or whatever you want to call them, they need to be shut down. They need to be dealt with. And we have not seen that yet. So I would argue that we need to address it through Pakistan. We can try to work it from the Saudi angle, stopping the private money going in, but I would make the Pakistanis responsible for what's happening on their territory.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I see my time's expired, but let me just say to you that it appears to me that maybe we should talk to Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states and say when they do give this money for teaching Islam, that they make sure that the madrasas that are getting it don't teach this radicalism. I don't know how that's done, but I'm very concerned that the long-term problems over in Pakistan are not going to go away. That's a nuclear power, and it's a breeding ground right now for terrorism, and many of the terrorists came from there that attacked in Saudi Arabia, that attacked the World Trade Center, and it just seems to me that we got to find some way to cut off the funding for the instruction that's going to these people that's radicalizing them. And that may not be the only place they're being taught this radical approach, but that certainly is one of them, and we know that, and we got to do. And the other thing is, Saudi Arabia is worried to death, and so are the Gulf states, about Iran becoming a nuclear power, and they're being able to run that whole region. And if Pakistan were to fall to the Taliban, and you had Iran becoming a nuclear power, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states would be at their mercy, and they know that right now. So I can't understand why they can't say that the money that they're sending for these educational purposes is for education and not for any radicalization. And they ought to be able to set standards and boundaries on how that money's used, so that we cut back on the amount of radicals that are being taught that in madrasas.
The chair will recognize the chair, Mr. From California.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to my friend from Indiana. I met this morning with the ambassador, the Saudi Arabian ambassador, and I asked him a number of these questions, and I'd suggest it's worth the time to do it, because these were questions that were raised on our trip to India and Pakistan, and they've been around for a long time, this whole issue of, quote, Saudi money. And he makes a few points. One, there are a very large number of both Pakistani and other nationals in Saudi Arabia who, surprise of surprises, send remittances back to their home country, to the families in their countries. Secondly, that the Saudis have internalized the danger of the of violent radical suicide bomb, the whole threat of radical terrorists in terms, and are looking for any actionable information on who in their kingdom is actually doing the kind of funding through. They think they've dealt with the charities, but they're open to getting any actionable intelligence. It was an interesting meeting, but that isn't why we're here. Well, maybe it is, but I want to take a little time. I have the misfortune of hearing We've brought three really excellent witnesses who have spent time thinking about it and written testimony that I haven't yet read, and then listening to them summarize very quickly some of their thoughts in my somewhat limited capacity to absorb everything they're saying as quickly as they're saying it. So I'd like to deconstruct the bill for a second and then sort of see if to put it back together. Do you think we should be providing a significant amount of security assistance to Pakistan? I mean, that's sort of a yes or no kind of thing. Everybody seems to be saying yes. And is our goal beyond just making the Pakistani government and the Pakistani military leadership happy with us, or do we have a strategic objective along the lines outlined by Ambassador Holbrooke of one, helping us be successful in Afghanistan, two, helping Pakistan resist more effectively the internal insurgency that it faces, and providing the means and the equipment to accomplish both of those goals. Is that the purpose of this security assistance, or is it a more general walking around money to build a good relationship with the government?
We want them to be more effective in prosecuting our mutual objectives.
All right.
I would add one more, ending dual policies that also cause instability in Pakistan itself. Dual policies towards terrorists, which actually lead to instability within Pakistan.
Incentivizing the rejection of what some people refer to as appeasement agreements with these forces that end up only holding for a short period of time and then come back to haunt them. All right, now we have, so if that's the goal, and now we have to sell the United States Congress on authorizing and appropriating a significant amount of security assistance in the wake of 8 or 9 years of providing a lot of assistance for which we didn't have benchmarks, we didn't have metrics, we didn't have accountability, we didn't have monitoring, and I think one of you mentioned the coalition support funds, which was a wonderful story of money going somewhere for something that no one can tell me what it was for. Why is it such a, in the right way, why is it so, why doesn't it make some sense for, let me back up a second. We have heard, Ambassador Holbrooke talked a little bit about it. The Pakistan military, and probably their political leadership, sees a well-armed opponent, enemy, rival, across the border on the east. There have been a series of clashes, and for them, for a very long time, that has been the dominant political threat or opponent. If our goal is strengthening their ability to fight the insurgency and dealing with those people who would do us harm in Afghanistan and those organizations that would try and hit us here, what is wrong with trying to ensure that the money we're giving, that American taxpayers are giving, isn't for those purposes rather than the purposes that Pakistan might have historically used the money for?
It's absolutely the right goal. The point of, I think, some of the criticism of the way in which that goal is being achieved is that it is perceived by those actors, and in this case it is the Pakistani military leadership, as something that is deeply difficult for them politically to accept in the Pakistani political context. So our goal is to enhance the capacity and the will.
Because and does that mean that you are sure they share our goal, want the money for the same goal that we have, or that they're deeply offended because it somehow constrains them for doing some of the things they might otherwise want to do.
No, I think we are playing into a political debate within Pakistan, which has different actors, some of whom are more inclined to do the things that we want, and some of whom are not. And our goal should be to support those actors who are inclined to do what we want and give them a confidence that we will be with them over a long haul. Now, we cannot be sure that they'll win the debate inside of Pakistan. And so empowering them that we achieve our success. Our statements publicly of suggesting sanctions and the implication of not doing, if they don't do what we want, that we will pull the money away, basically undercuts those potential partners. It doesn't mean that that's not what we want them to do. It's simply that's not probably the best mechanism for getting them to do it. And that is not, I should say, an implication that we should just simply be shoveling more money at them, but that doing it through legislation is probably not the most effective way to achieve our goal.
So, first of all, the failure to appropriate additional funds for security assistance is not a sanction. There's no doubt that some of our policies, that amendment, the Pressler Amendment, things like this, constrained our flexibility too much. But I don't think our bill should be viewed as sanctions for not doing something. It's sort of trying to set up some process for continuing to do a much greater effort than we have been doing. Let's assume we persist with this effort and somehow manage to get it through, and in the end of the day, it becomes law, and the appropriators go along with it. What's the Pakistani reaction going to be?
Well, I would just point out that, part of the bill is, authorizing $1.5 billion in economic assistance without condition.
Right.
And I think that shows very strongly a long-term commitment and wanting to partner with Pakistan. So I think we just need to keep that in mind. And hopefully that would be, what would Pakistanis would focus on. I think that, the idea of conditioning, while I acknowledged in my remarks that we need to do it in a way that we do acknowledge Pakistani security concerns. We don't want to come across as not taking seriously their concerns. That's part of a partnership, understanding what are your core security concerns. But they need to understand our core security concerns, which is stabilizing, securing Afghanistan. And so we need to sort of remove the emotion here and look at what we're trying to achieve. And I think in terms of the Pakistani reaction, I think the majority of Pakistanis would relish seeing more transparency in our aid, the way we provide aid. I mean, you had many Pakistanis wondering, where did all that security assistance go? They were wondering, just like a lot of Americans were. So I think it actually helps to provide a more even keel relationship and more transparency in our partnership.
But that's what we're trying to do in this legislation.
Agreed.
Yes.
Well, my concern, Lisa and I are probably on the same page on this. We actually have large areas of goals that actually don't overlap. And we know about the transcripts from Kiani saying that Haqqani is a strategic asset. So my concern is that we really do have to grapple with reality that we don't have the...
You're talking about Fatah Haqqani,
I'm
not
talking
Ambassador.
about... No, exactly. I'm talking about... Yes, exactly. So there are a number of individuals, like, for example, Malvi Nazir, obviously Haqqani, Hekmat Yar, that they still see as assets, which are actually undermining our interests in Afghanistan. And, the last 8 years has really been a period of ignoring this reality. So I actually am very pleased that there is some effort to grapple with this. I think part of the failure of the last 8 years of programming really has been this coalition support funds and the lack of willingness to demand transparency and accountability. Now, I will say this. Pakistan has developed a tremendous sense of entitlement to U.S. funding. Therefore, not appropriating does seem redolent of, in fact, some kind of sanction. But what's interesting about this bill, and which makes the issues of conditionality much more challenging, is that you've already narrowly focused the majority of the assistance to helping them do the things that we want them to do, which is go after the bad guys. But we've seen the last couple of years that the sense of the Congress has actually been overridden. We saw the discussion a couple years back that F-16s are an effective counterinsurgency tool. So if you're confident that the money is going to be spent on the stuff you want them to do, there is an argument to be made that the conditionalities in state are kind of irrelevant. I mean, to play devil's advocate, do we really want to constrain ourselves from helping the Pakistanis go after the people we want them to go after?
To constrain ourselves from
allowing helping the because we're basically most of the aid is going to counterinsurgency and counterterrorism.
So the limitation that says 75% of this money has to go to those purposes doesn't bother you?
No, I actually very much support that. The long haul of U.S.-Pakistan relations has been Pakistan saying, I support your strategic goals, when in fact it doesn't, and it uses that assistance to prepare itself for its strategic goal, which is its fight with India. So I have been long saying, get rid of CSF. There should really be a collaborative programming to help them do the things that they want to do. Now, the Army's been very clear. They don't want to become a counterinsurgency force, which is why in my written testimony, we have missed an enormous opportunity.
Yes, on the police. And we do have some reference to it, but we're going to expand that. We take your point on that.
Just to respond to the specific question of how would the Pakistanis respond, assuming that this became law. They will take the money. They will, those within the Pakistani military will, some of them resent us for...
They're not going to get money. They're going to get equipment. They're going to get material. They're going to get training. They're going to get...
They will take all of that, and they will take the $1.5 billion on the civilian side.
Yes.
So internally, there will be some resentment and some grumbling. This will not help us in internal debates within the Pakistani army to the extent that we care about that. Then they will proceed to fail on a number of accounts that have been laid out within the legislation. They will not achieve all of the things that we want, including, for instance, providing AQCON. I'm almost 100% sure of that.
The bill doesn't require them to provide AQCON.
I understand. And then we will come back...
Oh, but if you understand...
Well, I'm saying this is a request that we have. That was the sense of the Congress, is that they should pony up AQCON. That's
he said that they should work with us to dismantle this proliferation network, and if it's necessary, include in that access to people who are involved.
Okay,
another example.
Okay, that's fair. There will be other areas where they will fail to meet our stated goals, probably including there will be evidence of some continued collaboration, cooperation, assistance, passive or active, with groups that we perceive to be working counter to our purposes. I think that is fair to say. A year from now, we will come back, and the administration will be in a tough position of having to ask for waivers, and then we will be back, and it's hard to see where that benefits the broader, longer-term goal of building up partners in Pakistan state, society, and military who are willing to work with us.
And see, I look at it a little differently. I think fundamentally we're really only requiring two things. One, that the president, after looking at everything, conclude, one, that Pakistan is committed to this counterinsurgency campaign, and secondly, that he thinks on balance, you have the negatives, you have the positives, it's not going to be perfect. We know that on balance, they're making some progress because of whether it's because of that commitment and because of the assistance we're giving them and their own contributions, making some progress in dealing with it. And then everything else is just sort of indicators, not an exclusive list of them, of what they should be doing. And it doesn't seem like a huge reach when you're asking the Congress to do all this, to at least sort of lay out what we expect to get here. Go, yeah.
Then I think the earlier discussion of the sweet spot and the framing of precisely kind of language that would be less difficult for Pakistanis to take is exactly the way to go. And that sounds like the way you're going, so that's great.
Thank you.
The gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Let me thank the chairman and good news is that the bells, there's 15 minutes to vote, so I have a long time to talk with you. Let me thank the chairman for this hearing and both chairpersons, the presiding chairperson as well, and allow me to express some widely held levels of frustration. If you doom a person or a country to fail, they will fail. And to a large degree, I've heard discussions of failure, and it's frustrating. I think we need to recount the history of Pakistan, its original founder, even though it was founded out of the dissecting of the large area that now includes India and Bangladesh, for reasons that we might debate now. Mr. Jinnah was a person who believed in democracy, though he acknowledged the distinctions between those who lived predominantly in India, or the territory where India is, and the differences as relates to Islam, and wanted to have a country of Muslims, but he believed in democracy. Secondarily, my understanding is that Pakistan did wage a valiant battle during the 20-year Afghan-Russian war and worked alongside of the United States, and we are still reminded of that departure. Thirdly, there is a vast constituency of educated Pakistanis, of business class and others, who want a stable Pakistan. Does anyone care about working with them? You cannot move forward if you do not allow some good news to come out of Pakistan. And from experts to a range of others, we can't seem to capture any good news. Now, I join with my colleagues. I believe we have to get to the bottom of AQ-CON. If that requires some classified briefings, which we need to have, and I thank the chairman for helping us and assisting us with that, that is vital, because we need to get an understanding of where we stand as relates to AQ-CON's proliferation, continued dialogue, what he did in the past. But I do think it's worth noting that there were briefings last week at the White House, and the administration came away with a certain calm about whether or not they were proliferating nuclear secrets. So let me start with that premise. I've laid my cards on the table, and I appreciate that some of you as witnesses have been indicating, let's look at the facts, let's look at the facts. Ms. Fair, are you not, or is there not a contingent of peace-loving, democracy-loving Pakistanis that live in Pakistan?
Actually, I've done survey work on this issue. I have a survey right now going into the field of 6,000 people with a colleague at Princeton. We're looking at exactly this. In the survey that I fielded in 2007 when I was with the U.S. Institute of Peace, while the vast majority of folks did find al-Qaeda and other militant groups to be a significant threat, I did find anywhere between 1 in 3 and 1 in 5 largely urban respondents actually supported considerably or in a great deal a variety of militant attacks that we gave them to respond to. In addition, we also asked them whether or not...
What were these urban persons that you polled? Do you have an economic base, an educational base?
As a matter of fact, I'd be happy to brief you if you're interested in this. My colleague at Princeton, he's an econometrician, so we were able to crosswalk our data with household economic survey data, and we had a number of very surprising results. Not surprising to us because it's a very robust result across the work and variety of countries. The least poor and the rich were not the ones who supported these terrorist groups on the main. It was actually the middle class. It's that very middle class that everyone talks about strengthening. The least educated are not the ones that worry about this. Again, it's the people who's right in the middle.
And the least educated dominate Pakistan. Is that correct?
Well, depends on the
Yes, they do. The least educated dominate. The poor are the greater population of Pakistan.
Absolutely. There's no.
So then we have a good base between the poor and the very rich that we could at least begin with.
Absolutely.
And we certainly have to address the question of the middle educated. And I'm not doubting your data. In fact, I'm very glad, and I would like to have a briefing. But my belief is that if we cannot find some common ground to work with, they are going to fail. I do think it is important for there to be a stable government. And so my question would be, to Mr. Markey the importance of possibly a unity government between the Sharif brothers and the present government. Is that has any possibility or legs to it?
Well, as we've seen over the past year, there are a lot of possible configurations you could have in Pakistani politics, but the kind of debate that we've seen emerge and the kind of recurrent disagreements between those two parties over the past several months lead me to believe that there's a great deal of question that you would see a true unity government. But what you have seen is the return of a PMLN government, the Nawaz Sharif's brother, Shahbaz Sharif, heading up in Punjab, and a center government by the PPP. This could conceivably be a relatively reasonable, stable way to move ahead over the next several years.
So what we should do is...
But that's not necessarily a unity government.
No, and I understand that, and I take your comment on that. So we should try to encourage, I think your comment is instructive. We should try to encourage at least dialogue, resolution around issues. And so as we discuss and have meetings with our friends this week from Pakistan, we should emphasize that level of stability if we can.
Absolutely.
And that would not be considered intrusive. You were, I guess, in the audience when Ambassador Holbrooke spoke, and you know that his mission is Afghanistan and Pakistan. I've always made the argument that there should be a regional effort. Obviously, the plate would be very full, but we should never leave out Bangladesh. We're delighted that they are at least not in the mainstream news at this point. We thank them for that, having visited them some years ago. And India, though we recognize that India doesn't want that to be their defining definition to the world. And I appreciate that. But is there some value to looking forward, putting aside some of the mountains we have to climb, Kashmir, Mumbai, but should there be some sort of regional discussion so that there are some discussions that we foster, if you will, that would include India, Afghan, Pakistan, and maybe even Bangladesh?
Absolutely, there should be a regional discussion. I would extend the regional discussion to go to China, to go to Saudi Arabia, which has come up in some of the earlier conversation here. But the problem is that there, in the particular instance of India, there's as much chance that if we extend, say, the writ of Ambassador Holbrooke to India, that it is a counterproductive move to do it publicly and to try to make that kind of conversation a broad diplomatic one with a high level of intense focus publicly. That may actually hurt us. So it's probably better, and I think most people have come around to the idea that India needs to be a part of our strategic view of the region, but it may not need to be central to our diplomacy in a public sense.
Well, I think you've answered the question. There should be a regional approach, and the tactics is something that we should be sensitive to, and I agree, because that's why I started by saying they're not necessarily interested in being defined in that manner. Let me quickly go as the time, let me emphasize to all of you to answer this one. I think Chairman Berman has struck a very effective chord. It seems to be some discord about how that works, but we understand that the madrasa, if I could finish this question, I'd appreciate it. If the madrasa is a school, the Taliban is a student, how much more can we do to get Pakistan to put real schools in place for these poor people mostly?
The vast majority of madrasas, there's actually different kinds of madrasas. There's primary madrasas where children simply learn to memorize the Quran as a part of going to other schools. So we have to really think about what a madrasa is. And there's, as Lisa Curtis has said, we actually know with some certainty where the bad madrasas are. And in many cases, what we really should be focusing on training camps. I don't believe that the Ministry of Education is a partner. It's a status quo institution. No ministry or Department of Education wants to be told what their curriculum is. But there are a number, and I'll tell you, there's an interesting survey of students about their attitudes towards militancy. And it would perhaps not surprise you that the attitudes of madrasa students and public school students towards militancy is actually not that dissimilar. The private school students, well, let me put it to you, I want to live next to their houses. So I think we really need to be creative. The private school sector is growing. It accounts for 30% of Pakistan's student body that attends school full-time. Public schools are 70%. Madrasas are a rounding error. So I think we need to be creative. We need to work with people who want to work with us. All parents in Pakistan, they want their kids to be well prepared for the workplace. They want jobs for their kids. But we should really not underestimate the degree to which they want their children to be good Muslims. There's a lot of parallels to be drawn, I think, to the parochial school movement here at the turn of the century. And rather than alienating people who want religion in their schools, maybe we should be partnering up with organizations that do parochial schooling here, because I think they share many of the same values. There are many Islamic schools here in the States who have struck a balance between producing good Muslim values and also producing a good education. This goes back to your diaspora question. We've got loads of Pakistanis here that find a way of balancing their commitment to Islam and their commitment to educating their children. And these are the sorts of organizations that we should be engaging to go back to Pakistan and help madrasas professionalize. Again, not all madrasas are simply teaching Quranic memorization. Jamaat Islami madrasas, since the 1960s, have been teaching a social studies curriculum. And in fact, many people will tell you that a Jamaat Islami madrasa is better than your average Pakistani public school. So we really do need to rethink the way we conceive of the Pakistan educational problem. There are more solutions out there than I think we give ourselves credit for.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence, and I thank the witness and look forward to
Other
working with the Pakistan community.
additional answers will be submitted for the record. Without objection, members who are unable to make an opening statement may submit the statements for the record. Without objection, the full testimony of the witness on the second panel shall be made part of the record. This hearing is adjourned. Oh, that was